Summer of the 20s, the sea washing over Malta. The men were drinking in their cabin. Choi Hyun-min, 26 years old, recently graduated from college, unemployed. As he lay there, he smiled and asked when he had last felt so carefree. Hyun-min couldn't believe they were on a dive tour because it was something incredible to him. He turned to his friend and asked him, smiling, why he was reading books even on vacation. That friend was Lee Chang-hyun. Jang-hyun said that he would need it in the future. Hyun-min asked what it was about and if it was interesting. Then he noticed the title Odyssey on the cover. My friend told me that it's a pretty long story. It's an epic poem about the hero Odysseus, a story about the journey home. Jong-hyun said he would only tell his friend a part of it. He asked me if I knew that the place where they would be diving was Gozo Island. In the book, that island is the place where a goddess named Calypso lives. In the middle of the book, after the Trojan War, Odysseus sails to this island. Calypso falls in love with him so much at first sight that she does not let Odysseus leave the island for 7 years. But when Athena found out that her dear friend could not return home, she asked her father and the king of the gods, Zeus, to help Odysseus escape. In the end, Calypso, who allows her lover to leave, is left alone on the island, living her life again in longing for Odysseus. Jang Hyun said he thinks books like this are really fascinating because they have something mysterious about them. He said that he likes the difference between the imaginary and the real. After listening to his friend, Hyun-min said that there is no such thing. Then Jang-hyun said that he was an idiot for talking to his friend about this in front of all these people. He asked why he shouldn't go to bed then. Hyun-min laughed and said he was joking. He asked Jong-hyun if he didn't think the situation with the goddess Calypso was horrible, because keeping a person captive for 7 years is a horror. The boy said that he would also like to escape. Suddenly, the ship was lifted by a wave and Hyun-min fell out of bed, hitting his head on the ground. When he sat up, he put his hand to his head and asked why the waves were so strong out of the blue. Then his friend said that it must be a warning. Hyun-min looked up at his friend in surprise. Jang-hyun coldly said that the waves warned him not to say the names of deities in vain, because he might die after knowing the wrath of God. Hyun-min looked at his friend in surprise and said that his hair stood on end. Then the boy started laughing loudly. Jang-hyun asked if he was scared. Hyun-min kicked his friend's bed and said he didn't believe it. The friend laughed and said that he was really scared, and Hyun-min asked if he wanted to go there. The next day, the man said that they would dive in groups of 2, as previously announced. He told them to keep an eye on their companions. After that, the man said that it would rain in the afternoon, so let them relax while it was sunny. Hyun-min jumped into the water with his friend. They dived in and looked at various corals, sharks, and turtles with fascination. It was starting to get gloomy on the surface, but Hyun-min was distracted by a blue hole in the bottom. He thought about how he had never heard of blue holes in this place. Blue holes are underwater caves or depressions open to the surface that form when the earth underwater falls deeper. Hyun-min started waving and shouting at his friend to take a look, but Jang-hyun didn't care and continued to go about his business. When Hyun-min realized that his friend didn't care, he decided that he would be an honorary pioneer of this path. He started to swim into the hole thinking that he would be back soon. As he swam in, he looked up thinking that it was very beautiful, and he hadn't noticed when he swam in, but it was quite deep. Then he thought that he should go up the mountain and tell about it. When he was about to get up, someone grabbed his leg and started pulling him down. He was scared, and when he looked down, he saw a creature holding him. More and more air was leaving his lungs, and he mentally begged for someone to save him. The 2 creatures that grabbed Hyun-min dragged him to land. One said that they had returned with a human and asked what he would order them to do. She asked if they should hang the man upside down, or maybe pull out his eyes. A large, powerful man stood before them. His eyes shone and his earrings sparkled in the light. He held his arms folded under his chest and watched calmly. Then the creature said that they were waiting for his order and called the man by the name of Calypso. Hyun-min woke up and opened his eyes calmly, but was immediately surprised to find himself hanging upside down. He wondered in his mind what the hell was going on and what was going on here, but he only mumbled out loud. Then someone nearby asked him if he had finally woken up, which drew the guy's attention. The man standing in the shadows said that he hadn't moved and he thought he was dead, but now they could talk. He was slowly coming into the light. It was hard not to notice his handsome features and bright green eyes. He held his arms folded under his chest as before and smilingly welcomed Hyunmin to his island. The boy looked at the stranger in amazement and could only exclaim in admiration. He wondered in his mind what kind of clothes he was wearing because they looked like something he had seen in cartoons when he was little. He started laughing, and the serious man asked what he found so funny. Hyunmin replied excitedly that it was nothing. He wondered in his mind what had happened. He remembered that he had been kidnapped by strange things. But after that, nothing. He wondered if he was imagining things. Then Hyunmin smiled and asked if the man could let him down now. He said he was with a friend, so he had to call him. The man said it would be nice if he could lend him his phone. Then Calypso said that he understood that the guy hadn't yet realized his situation. The man smiled and said that he would do him a favor and explain what was happening. He told him that this was the kingdom of the gods and it was completely different from the world of men. The man said that he was the ruler of this island and called himself Calypso. When Hyunmin heard the name Calypso, he began to remember that he had heard it somewhere before. Then he remembered that the book was about an island where a goddess named Calypso lived. Now the boy turned to his friend, thinking about what he had said about loving jokes but not being the butt of them. He asked the man if he could tell his friend that he was already thinking about his actions. Hyunmin said that they were only separated for a minute and he did not know that he was going to lose consciousness, and in any case, he was fine now. At first, the boy spoke very calmly, and then he started shouting to his friend and told him to stop playing games and untie him because his whole body was numb from the spring upside down. Then he asked if Calypso wasn't a goddess, and if his friend couldn't find someone else to play Calypso, so he sent the boy. The man smiled in surprise and said that he was much more interesting than he first thought and that he was going to kill him. Then Calypso went up to the guy and put his fingers in his hair and said that he had changed his mind. He smiled and said that now he might let him live, but they would see. The man said that there were not many things for the boy to think about. Hyunmin smiled excitedly and wondered in his mind if his parents had taken out a loan in his name and if that was why he was here playing this role-playing game with the kidnapping. Suddenly, something started to happen. Hyunmin asked him what he was doing. He told the man not to touch him there and told him to stop. When the guy was on his feet, he was catching his breath with a red face. Meanwhile, Calypso looked at him with a calm look and said that it was unexpected. The man said that the boy had called him dirty, but who would have thought that he would not mind taking a bath? Angry, Hyunmin said that it was because he had touched him in the wrong places. He asked what kind of pervert would make a stranger bathe with him naked. Hyunmin held his head and thought that the man was a pervert for threatening him first, and then wanting to help him wash. Suddenly, he remembered what the man had said about this being the realm of the gods and being completely different from the human world. Then Hyunmin thought that if this guy was telling the truth, then this could be the afterlife or something. He put his hand to his mouth and thought that now everything was clear and he was finally punished. He thought that if he had known, he would have been kinder and not teased the neighbor's dog or refused to wait for the others to take the elevator. Hyunmin thought it was sad, and he probably understood what was happening. He wondered if he had been tortured in the Western way when he drowned. Then Calypso drew his attention to him by saying that he was quiet, which meant that his mind was racing. He said that he would give him time to be alone, but insisted that he take a bath, because the human body is weak, and if he does not wash in the local water, he will soon fall asleep. The man smiled and added that of course he would not try to persuade him if he refused. When Hyunmin plunged into the water with his clothes on, Calypso asked if he would bathe like that. He said that he liked to bathe in his clothes while sitting in the water. Then the man asked again and said that it was quite original. Then he turned around and smilingly said that he should order his maids to give him fresh clothes. The man said that he had washed every crevice, if possible, because the skin could rot where the water did not reach. As Calypso was walking away, Hyunmin noticed him smiling. After the man disappeared from view, he thought that he couldn't believe he was scared. He touched his clothes and thought that he couldn't take any chances, so he'd probably take off his clothes to wash. Hyunmin lay on the bed and thought about how he wanted to die. He remembered how the maids dressed him when he covered himself with his hands and said he could do it himself. He asked why they kept dressing him, and then one of the maids said that it was Calypso's order. Now he was lying there thinking about how it happened that he was dressed by a bunch of strangers. The guy said that the most humiliating thing was that they didn't care at all. He twisted around and asked why this cape was so light. because it made his buttocks freeze. He was calling Calypso names, saying that it was all because of him. He remembered how the man said he would look after him from now on. Hyunmin stood up abruptly, saying that it made him angry. He wondered in his mind who gave him the right to watch him. Then in a calm voice, the guy said that it didn't matter what happened, because he wasn't going to die here. He was determined to get off this perverted island no matter what it took. When Hyunmin was trying to run away, he thought about how everything had been beautiful and elegant before he made that decision, but it was very empty, and he didn't see any servants. He wondered in his mind if it was really a palace. He thought that maybe they had just left and that it was for the best. When the guy started to come out from behind the column, he thought that he could use this chance to escape. He was already determined to do so, but suddenly a hand grabbed his shoulder and he turned around in fright. Calypso sat quietly saying that he had heard that he was looking for him in the middle of the night. He said that the situation seemed like a misunderstanding and asked him why he thought it was. Hyunmin held his hand and wondered in his mind why he felt like he was caught skipping class and why he was nervous. He said, laughing, that he was actually getting a little bored, so he decided to leave. Calypso said that he understood, and of course being alone is quite boring. Then the man pointed to the chair next to him and told him to sit down. Calypso said that he was not used to receiving guests, so he did not know how to entertain him, but they could talk for a while. Hyunmin said that if he was bored, he could just call a servant and not worry about him. The guy thought that he just came to find out how to get off this island. Then the man said he couldn't be friends with the servant because they had different statuses. Hyunmin asked if that meant he had no friends at all. Calypso smiled and asked if he had no friends, would the boy become his friend? Hyunmin smiled and said that the man was unbearable and he really had no friends, because who would want to be friends with a pervert who threatened to kill him? He told the man to think about his attitude towards others. Then Calypso leaned over a little and told him to teach him the right attitude and asked him what he should do to become friends with someone. The boy asked again, and when he nodded in agreement, he said that first, to get close to someone, he had to stop talking in such a familiar way and find out what they liked and disliked. Then the man asked if that was all or if there was anything else. Hyunmin wondered if just getting drunk together would be enough to become friends, because that's how it usually works between adults. Suddenly an idea came to him. Clearing his throat, he said that he actually knew one way to become friends without all that. He smiled as he thought about the bottle and thought that was all he needed. The guy recalled that during his student years, he was a record holder for the amount of alcohol he drank on holidays. He was the king of parties, Choi Hyunmin. Hyunmin started pouring alcohol and thought that no matter how strong this god was, he could get drunk too. He no longer had any reason to get the man drunk. He was determined to wait until the man was drunk to the point of unconsciousness and take the opportunity to escape. Calypso said that he could not remember the last time he had a drink with a person. He asked if they would become friends if they drank a whole bottle of wine. The guy smiled and said, of course, encouraging the man to drink faster. They had already drunk several bottles and jugs. Hyunmin was already drunk by then, and while holding the glass, he thought that this wine was really good. He said that if a man sold this wine in Korea, he would become a millionaire. Calypso asked about Korea and asked if that was the name of his home. Meanwhile, the guy continued to drink, and the man told him to control how much he drank because too much would lead to intoxication. Hyunmin grabbed the bottles close to him and replied in denial. Calypso looked at his reddened face with wide, surprised eyes. Then the boy took one bottle and pointed it at the man and asked if he was really still not drunk. He stood up and leaned over to God and told him to drink more. Calypso smiled and waved his hand, telling him to sit down. But Hyunmin was not going to stop. He put one hand on Calypso's shoulder and his foot between the man's knees and put the bottle to his lips and said that if he got drunk, he could escape. The guy slowly approached Calypso's lips. When their lips were just a few millimeters apart, the man swallowed excitedly. Suddenly, Hyunmin fainted and fell on top of the man. Calypso supported him with one hand and managed to catch the bottle with the other. He was calling out to the man in shock, but the man could not hear him. Hyunmin was lying on the man's chest, sleeping peacefully. Then Calypso wondered in his mind if he had really fallen asleep. He grabbed the man's face and, looking at him, said that he realized that this was his plan. Calypso said that even for a minute he thought he was funny, and he hadn't had so much fun since he let Odysseus go. When he remembered Odysseus, an image of a man smiling and saying his name appeared in his mind. After this memory, Calypso looked upset, and he took the bottle and began to swallow directly from his throat. The man put the bottle on the table, saying that he was a little drunk. After that, Calypso gently picked up Hyunmin in his arms. He slowly carried him to the bed and gently set him down to say goodnight. Hyunmin woke up to the sound of birds singing calmly, opening his eyes and wondering when he had fallen asleep. When he looked up, he was surprised to see Calypso sleeping peacefully across from him. The guy jumped up sharply and looked at the man with a shocked look. He wondered in his mind why he was lying next to him. Hugging his shoulders, he thought that it was good that he was wearing it, because it meant that his virginity was preserved. His attention was drawn to a table with bottles and jugs that were completely empty. He was shocked and wondered if it was the two of them who had drunk so much wine. He grabbed his head, thinking that he couldn't remember anything and couldn't believe that he had gotten so drunk that he had passed out. Suddenly, his attention was diverted by a smiling man who propped his head up with his hand and asked if he had finally woken up. Calypso said that, judging by his expression, he had no idea what had happened. The man said that he bet they had just had a drink together like he wanted. Then he smiled and asked what the boy thought, whether they were friends now. Hyunmin looked at the man and thought about how it had been 2 days since he was stuck on this damn island, and the escape plan he had worked so hard to create had been a complete failure. Then he smiled and said that they were friends, of course. Hyunmin stared in shock and exclaimed in admiration. There were 2 horses in front of him, but with fishtails. He asked Calypso if it was a half horse and half fish and what was the name of this animal. Calypso said that it was a hippocampus, a creature that cannot be found in the human world. Then the guy said that if hippos live on this island, it means that they belong to a man. Calypso objected and said that they were the property of Poseidon, the god of the sea. He said that he only had to take care of them, and the boy could call it one of his duties. More precisely, he is temporarily looking after them. Hyunmin mentally asked about the duty, but then stopped himself, thinking that it was none of his business. Then he said that they looked pretty funny anyway and asked if he could come closer to them. Calypso said that he could, as long as he didn't fool around with them. The boy sat down enthusiastically next to the animal and touched its tail, thinking that it was real scales. The man smiled and asked if he liked it. Hyunmin smiled excitedly and asked why the man was asking. He said that if the man wanted him to pay for admission or something, he should know that he didn't have a penny to his name. Then Calypso said he was just taking his advice. When the boy asked in surprise, the man explained that they should stop talking to others in such a familiar way and share their preferences. He reminded him that they had discussed this before they had a drink. Hyunmin lowered his head, wondering why the man was acting like this. Then he looked up at the man and asked if he was going to kill him. He said he didn't want to be his friend at all. The guy wanted to tell him the real reason why he offered him a drink yesterday, but Calypso interrupted him, saying that he knew. The man reminded him that he had said he wanted to leave the island. He said, smiling, that there was nothing he could do, because a person cannot leave this place without the help of the inhabitants of this kingdom. Calypso said that he could only entertain him and beg him to return home. He wanted to say something else, but suddenly saw the boy running away. Hyunmin sat on the hippocampus. Calypso was running toward him, telling him to stop, because these creatures could not bear his weight. Then the boy shouted in denial, telling the man to stop. He held the animal by the hair and said that he didn't want to listen to him anymore and had no intention of dying here. He kicked the animal's body to make it run. The hippocampus's eyes lit up and it jumped up angrily and began to laugh. Hyunmin grabbed the animal's mane tighter and thought in shock that it was too fast. While he was riding the animal, he noticed that it was about to dive into the water. When the hippo dived into the water with the boy on its back, the boy screamed out in fear. Hyunmin clearly did not expect this turn of events. Calypso whistled behind him, attracting the attention of the hippocampus. Then the animal's eyes, which had been glowing with anger, suddenly became very kind. Hyunmin looked at the man who was stroking the animal while water ran down his face. Calypso said that even though he was not the real owner of these rascals, he had been taking care of them for years, so it was not that difficult to call them back. He looked at the boy, saying that it was over, but he looked terrible. Hyunmin was covering himself with his hand because his clothes were completely soaked and the fabric was very thin and light, which made it start to show through. The guy looked away and told him not to laugh because he was embarrassed. Then Calypso looked at the guy and said that he needed to change his clothes first. Then he turned his attention to the man's leg and saw a wound there, so he said that he would have to treat it. Then the man pulled up a thin cloth and looked at his leg, saying that he did not remember how he did it. While he was thinking about his leg hurting a bit, Calypso told him that he was sure he had hit a rock. The man asked him if he realized that this happened because he did not listen to him. He calmly approached the boy and picked him up. Hyunmin wondered in his mind why he was doing this and said that if someone saw him, they would definitely take it the wrong way. He told the man that he could walk, so he should let him go. Calypso told the man not to move, because if he walked on his own, he would only do more harm. He turned his head and turned to Uno and Dos, his maidservants, and ordered them to watch over the hippocampi until they calmed down. At that moment, the boy looked at the maids in shock, who agreed with the man and wondered in his mind why they were here. While the man was carrying him, Hyunmin wondered if he was heavy. He thought about how he would never have imagined that he, a grown man, would be carried by someone, and it felt a little humiliating for him. He looked at the man and thought that he was quite handsome. When Calypso suddenly turned his calm gaze on him, the boy turned away and his cheeks turned red. All the while the maids were watching them in silence. The maids were observing the hippocampi and discussing a new topic that was interesting to them. A girl with green hair named Uno was the oldest of the 3 siren children. She said that Calypso seemed to be in love with that person. Das had blue hair and was the second of the 3 siren children. Das agreed with her sister and said that she understood him because the guy smelled incredible. Uno said he smelled delicious and she hadn't smelled blood in a long time. Dos covered her mouth and said that it was hard for her to resist. Then the younger sister said she was worried about the youngest. She said it didn't matter to them, but he was too loyal to Calypso. The second said that this boy could make a big mistake one day. Uno agreed with her sister, saying that Calypso was usually kind and understanding, but he would not allow her to cross the line. She hoped there would be no problems. While Calypso was wrapping his wounded leg, he thought that it was all strange, and he had not even imagined that he would do it. He looked at how gently the man was wrapping his leg and thought that maybe he was better than he thought. Feeling Calypso's warm hands on his leg, he began to blush. When Calypso finished, he stood up and looked at the boy and said that if he left it for a day or two, it would get better. Hyunmin stared at the man for a second longer and then looked away in shame, thanking him. The man smiled and said that he knew how to express gratitude. He said that it looked like his trouble was worth it. Blushing even more, Hyunmin began to say excitedly that this time it was partly his fault. He embarrassedly said that if he hadn't acted like a pervert from the beginning, the guy would have treated him differently. Calypso, asking if it was really so, reached out and pulled off the guy's cloak. Hyunmin smiled excitedly and said that he had given him the cloak to keep warm and asked why he was trying to take it away. Then Calypso smiled and leaned as close to the boy as possible, saying that if he was labeled a pervert, then maybe he should act like one. He put his hand on the boy's buttocks. Hyunmin took a deep breath, and his face turned red, and he wondered if the man knew where he was touching him. He took the man's hand away and apologized, saying that he had confused the two. The guy said that he was a man, like the other one, with the same device. Calypso intercepted the boy's hand and said that he didn't know if he was stupid or unintelligent, but he certainly realized that they were both men. At that moment, Hyunmin's face lit up and the man started laughing. He didn't understand what made him laugh so much. Calypso turned around and said that if he could see his face, he would have laughed too. This made Hyunmin angry, and he asked if he was too excited because he was being a little friendly with him. Calypso asked if he could let him win or not. The angry man then shouted out that these were his words. The man looked at him, thinking that it was too obvious that he was very angry. Then he patted him on the head and told him to rest, and then turned around and left. Hyunmin put his hand to his head and said that the man was treating him like a child. Suddenly he remembered the moment the man's hand touched his buttocks and his face flashed again. He was angry with himself, asking what he was thinking, because this bastard treats people like idiots. He mentally told Calypso to wait, and he would try to escape again as soon as his leg healed. Suddenly a man entered the room. He spoke to Calypso and then turned his head and asked Hyunmin who it was. The man again addressed Calypso and said that it was Tress and he had just returned. Hyunmin mentally questioned himself and thought about how he hadn't heard that name before. He mentally wondered what he should do or if he should tell her that Calypso wasn't here. Then he mentally denied it, thinking that this place was too unpredictable and he'd rather pretend he wasn't here. When Tress didn't hear an answer, he thought he shouldn't be here. He turned around to leave, but a smell caught him. It was the smell that came from the wound on Hyunmin's leg. It hit the man's nose and he couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, Hyunmin looked out from around the corner, mentally wondering if he had left. He turned his head back and exhaled, saying that the guy was still a problem regardless of his presence or absence. But suddenly he was scared when he noticed sharp claws next to his face. Tres coldly asked him who he was and what the man was doing in Calypso's bed. While Hyunmin was silent in shock, the man pressed his claw to his neck and asked if he planned to be silent forever. The boy looked at the man and wondered where his voice had gone and what he should say to him. Then Calypso appeared behind the man and ordered him to remove his hands. Tres turned a surprised look to Calypso, but did not take his claws away from the boy's neck. Then Calypso reminded him with a cold look that he had told him to take his hands off the boy. Tres abruptly removed his hand, hiding his claws, and apologized. He was surprised to hear that this meant that the man was allowed to stay in his chambers. Calypso walked past him, confirming this, and ordered him to leave them. Tres said without turning around that he understood and headed for the exit. Hyunmin held his neck, saying that he was scared. He asked what was wrong with that man and said that he must be some kind of devil because he had long fingernails. When he removed his hand from his neck, Calypso's hand reached out to him. He looked at it questioningly, but did not push it away. Then the man touched his neck and warmly looked him directly in the eyes and said that it was good that he was not hurt. Then Calypso lightly pressed his thumb on his cadaver. Hyunmin blushed, wondering if he was at it again. He mentally said that it was obvious that he was okay. He turned his head away and stammered that he was fine, that he could see that he was fine. That is, his life had flown before his eyes, but he was fine. Earlier, after that, I stroked Hyunmin and told him to get some rest and went outside. The man looked at his hand and thought that if he let things go, it could happen again. He wondered if it would be better to bring the man back to his world. After that, the man looked up and noticed Tres walking through the palace. If Calypso hadn't noticed him, things could have ended badly. Now he stood in front of the boy and asked him his name. The boy was surprised to hear him ask. Hyunmin wondered in his mind if he would be cursed if he told him his name. The man's eyes showed complete disbelief. Then Calypso said he wouldn't do anything. He was just wondering because he couldn't call him you or man anymore. Hyunmin agreed with the man's words, but wondered about further, as if they were still living together. Then he put his arm around his shoulder and said his name, and that he could just call him Hyunmin. Calypso repeated his name with a smile and said that from now on, when he addressed him, he would call him by his first name. Now Hyunmin was sitting on the grass under the moonlight. He was calling Calypso an idiot for forcing him to take off his clothes, carrying him around like a bride, and harassing a wounded man. The boy lowered his head, thinking that he does what he wants and how he wants, and called him incorrigible. But remembering these moments, Hyunmin thought that in such situations his heart was beating frantically. Even just remembering the moments, his heart beat loudly and his face turned red. Even though it was his own body's reaction, he was quite surprised. Then he stood up abruptly, asking if he thought it was funny to mock people. He shouted that when people laugh at him, he responds in kind and told Calypso to wait. The boy wanted to say that one day he would run away, but at that moment he lowered his head and looked sadly at his resolutely bent fist. Hyunmin had been thinking that he wanted to run away from here, but now he wondered what day he was talking about. He began to realize that he didn't really want to leave this place right now. Trust stood behind the boy, listening to Hyunmin's loud tirade. He called back, saying that he was looking for him. The boy turned around when he heard a familiar voice and saw Tres walking toward him. The man was smiling and asked if they could talk if there was no problem. Tres was smiling and apologizing and saying that it had been a long time since he had last seen the man in these places. He said he hoped the boy understood. Hyunmin looked at the smiling man while remembering their first meeting and wondered why he was so polite. He thought about how they seemed to be two completely different people then and now. Tres said he heard what happened. He said that Calypso brought the boy here because he was angry. Then Hyunmin sighed and said that you could say that, but in fact he kidnapped him. At that moment, the boy thought that he didn't even know why he was kidnapped. Then he turned to Tres and reminded him of what he had heard and asked why Calypso was so angry with him. Hyunmin wondered if he was serious and mentally saying that he couldn't believe it pissed him off. He remembered that day in the cabin when he said that it was horrible that the goddess had held a man captive for 7 years, and he would have liked to escape too. Now the guy was thinking about how he thought he was a god who stole people for petty reasons. Hyunmin looked to the side and wondered if he was thinking this way because he was God. Trez continued to smile and said that he must have been very confused to be in a strange place, not knowing anyone here. He said that if there was something exciting or unusual, he could come to him and he would keep it a secret from Calypso. The boy asked if he wasn't his subordinate and if he was allowed to come at all. Trez then said that he had heard that the guy's days were numbered, so let him consider this an apology. Upset by these words, Hyunmin sarcastically thanked the man in his mind. Suddenly, Trez turned a more serious gaze on the boy, thinking that if Calypso himself had invited him to his chambers, it meant that he found the man interesting. He thought that maybe now it was not serious, but then if they went further, he would not be able to bear it. Thinking about this, the man began to get angry and mentally said that he should be the only one on his side. Hyunmin smiled and thanked him for the warning and said that he would think about coming to him if he had any questions. Trez changed his cold gaze to a sweet smile and agreed with the boy. Hyunmin was digging for a rock and exhaling. He wondered if God shouldn't be more understanding. He thought that he should have given him time to make amends. Then he thought about what Trez had said about his days being numbered. He felt bad about those words, and if he had known that this would happen, he would have said goodbye to his family before he left. He looked up at the moon and said that he missed them. When he looked straight ahead, he saw a smiling Calypso, who said that he could see the guy wandering around carefree despite his injuries. The man asked where he had been. Hyunmin coldly replied that it was none of his business and that he was sick of this island everywhere he went. Although he answered so coldly, he wondered in his mind if the man was waiting for him. When he was already near Calypso, he told him that he had spoken to his subordinate. Then the man asked him which one and what he was talking about. Hyunmin turned his gaze in the other direction and said that it was Tress, I think. He told him that he was apologizing for what had happened that afternoon and that, unlike some petty people, he was quite receptive. Calypso then asked if Hyunmin meant him by someone. The guy shrugged and said that if it suited him, then let him. He walked ahead of him and Calypso followed, asking what they were talking about that he now considered him petty. Hyunmin asked if he hadn't said that he was overthinking things, and he said indifferently that he was overthinking things, that's all. Calypso watched Hyunmin go for a while and then grabbed his hand and called his name. When the boy turned around in surprise, his eyes rounded because the man was quite close. Calypso told him to tell him where he was going from now on, and the boy asked him why he should. Then the man said in a calm voice, looking him straight in the eye, that it was because he was worried about him. Hearing this, Hyunmin's heart pounded. But Hyunmin decided not to show his body's reaction, so he just laughed and said that was it. He agreed with a sigh, saying that he understood that he wanted him not to get into trouble again. The boy removed his hand and said that he wouldn't touch anything then. Hyunmin thought that the boy's affectionate words and actions were just a sign that he was having fun, but that he didn't really care. The boy thought that he had known him for a long time and knew what he was like, but for some reason he was very hurt. But suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Calypso, who agreed and called him a good boy. Blushing, Hyunmin began to ask him angrily if he was a child to him. Then he said that he was an adult, an intelligent person, which he had become not so long ago. The boy poked at the man and asked him how old he was and bet that he was not older than him. Then Calypso said in a calm voice that he stopped counting when he turned 100. Hyunmin was shocked when the man said he only knew that he was at least 1,000 years old. He asked the man to repeat how old he was, wide-eyed. Calypso said that it would not be surprising if it turned out that he was much older. He asked him how he thought it was logical that he treated him like a child. But the boy hardly listened to his words, just repeating in shock that he was 1,000 years old. The guy turned around and said, staggering in shock, that he had won in numbers and that he would now go to bed. Suddenly, Calypso called his name again. When he sideways glanced at the man inquiringly, he was smiling and bidding him good night. Hyunmin turned his reddened face away and quickly walked away and said good night in return. Calypso stood still, first looking down, and then raised his gaze to the moonlight. He turned to Odysseus and said that he began to spend much less time thinking about him. He would ask him what he thought about it. Behind him, behind the pillar, Tress stood silently listening to the man's words. A nest of sirens. Only the heads of Uno and Das remained the same. Their bodies had become bird-like, all feathers and wings and legs. They looked away when Tress addressed them. He called them sisters and said that he needed their help. Hyunmin sat on the bed, staring dumbfounded at the emptiness. When he remembered how Calypso had said goodnight to him, he started to laugh, saying that it was very embarrassing. He lay down on the bed and smilingly said that this Calypso spoke to him in such a tone, but he turned out to be a 1,000-year-old old man. He thought about what else he would make fun of him. Then his face grew serious, and he mentally wondered if he hadn't been in a bad mood recently. But then, with a grunt, he asked himself why he even cared. The guy decided to ignore it and just go to sleep. White birds flew to the palace in search of food. Calypso stared silently at the door of the room, wondering if he was still asleep because it was already noon. When he saw the boy, he addressed him by name, saying that he was nowhere to be found, so he thought he was sleeping. He asked if the boy had just gotten up. Hyunmin looked at him with a tired look and a bruise under his eyes, thinking that he hadn't been able to close his eyes all night. Calypso noticed this and asked what was wrong with his face. He explained that he hadn't slept well and asked if something was wrong. Calypso didn't miss this moment and asked him with a smile if maybe he hadn't slept because he was thinking about him. In fact, it was right on the money, but Hyunmin didn't want to show it. Blushing, the guy jumped up, saying that he had a very inflated ego. Calypso continued to smile and said that he looked bad and he thought to postpone it for later, but it seems his leg was healing. He looked at the man and said that his voice was loud enough that he didn't need to. The man said that he wanted to show him something and that he was surprised to ask if it was for him. Calypso smilingly said that it was personal for him. At this point, the boy wondered if he wanted to let him choose his own personal execution ceremony. But suddenly, their fascinating mental discussion was distracted by some sounds. Uno and Dos appeared in the palace in the form of birds. Dos turned to Calypso and said that they needed his presence at sea. Hyunmin stared at the maids in awe, wondering if they could fly as well. He thought it was like a fantasy because the girls could fly and swim. Calypso turned to them and asked what had happened. Dos said that the Kraken was suddenly angry and that this creature had made a mess on the southern coast. Calypso thought that this was strange, because the Kraken is not the kind of creature that would come out of the sea just like that. Then the man turned to Hyunmin and told him to stay here. He said he would show him what he was talking about when he returned. He turned away and agreed, thinking that the man might not actually show him. Suddenly, to the boy's surprise, the man began to approach him, put his arm around his neck, leaning against him and smiling, saying that he would be back soon. Calypso's wings appeared, and immediately afterwards he took off, while the boy looked on in amazement. Hyunmin grabbed one of the feathers that fell from Calypso's wings, asking if he could do it too. He said that he even thought for a second that he was an angel because it was the most divine form he had ever seen him in. When he remembered how Calypso had whispered in his ear that he would be back soon, he blushed and touched that ear. Hyunmin thought that there was no need to whisper like that, and he would have heard anyway. The guy really didn't understand Calypso. He wondered what he was up to because he just liked to make fun of people, and that was it. Now Hyunmin was thinking about the Kraken that had woken up. He wondered if it was the monster that looked like an octopus. The guy mentioned that he had seen it in movies a few times, and if it really existed, he was shocked. He wondered if maybe he should have asked to leave Calypso. Suddenly he felt tentacles fall on his leg and picked up a small octopus and said that this one looked exactly like him. Hyunmin held the octopus in his hands, and when it said something, he screamed in shock. Meanwhile, Calypso. He flew with his maidservants to the place where the events with the Kraken took place. The Kraken was shaking its tentacles in anger, and its eyes were glowing. The man looked at it and said that it was impossible. The Kraken came to the surface and lost control. Dos said that now the Kraken would not let them get closer and asked Calypso what to do. In a calm tone, the man asked where Tress was. The maids fussed, and Uno said that he had been sent to find the cause of the Kraken's anger, so he went to check another area. Dos complimented her sister and said that he would be back soon. After that, the girls looked at each other in silence. Last night in the Siren's Nest, Uno was asking me about the Kraken. She said that nothing might happen to Calypso and asked if Tress realized that if something went wrong, they would die. His sister sat next to him nodding in agreement. Then Tress said that was why he needed their help. The man said that when the Kraken wakes up, he will realize that his kids are gone, and of course he will be angry. And while Calypso is doing that, they will make a mess of the island and blame the man who was left alone. Stressa smiled and said that maybe now Calypso sympathizes with him, but when he finds out what a human can do to his island, even he will have a hard time finding an excuse. The sisters looked at each other and agreed to help him, but they had one condition. They turned and looked at Tresdos and said that he would be responsible for everything if anything happened later. The man, of course, agreed, and then smiled, saying that of course he would be responsible. Looking at the Kraken, Calypso said that there should be two of them, but for some reason he saw only one. The surprise maid said that it was true. When Calypso started to go downstairs, they asked where he was going. The man said that Tress had been gone too long, so he was going to check the places where the second Kraken might be. He told the girls to keep their distance and be on the lookout. After the girls agreed, he flew away, and Uno, remembering that he had said he would be back soon, asked what her sister thought, if anything would happen. Dos looked straight ahead, thinking about Tress and not expressing any emotions. Meanwhile, Tress was smiling and his claws were extended again, just like when he first met Hyunmin. He looked at the flowers he had cut and said that this should be enough. Picking up one flower, he looked at it and said that he had wanted to do this for a long time. One day, Tress was watching Calypso sit and admire the flowers. As he held another flower to his chest, he thought that Calypso loved flowers, and that meant he must like this one too. When he went behind the pillar and started to address the man, he was interrupted by Calypso's voice, which was addressing Odysseus, inhaling the flower's scent. Then Tress found out that Calypso goes to the garden so often not because he loves flowers, but because he can't forget his first love. Throwing away the flower he was holding in his hand, the boy thought that if this place was destroyed, Calypso would. Then the man turned around, saying that now he had to move on to the next point of the plan. When he looked at the cage, he saw that it was empty. Tress grabbed the cage in shock, asking how the man got out, because he had checked several times and it was locked. A lecture on escape. The Kraken is a cephalopod, and because it is slippery, it can easily slip between the bars of the cage. Hearing the sounds made by the octopus, Tress turned around. The Kraken was drawing his mother and himself in the sand. When Hyunmin saw it, he said that he drew it as if he were a child and wanted to become an adult as soon as possible. While he was laughing, the octopus tapped him on the arm. Then the boy asked if he was wrong at that moment. They looked like inseparable friends. Then the Kraken drew another adult octopus next to him and a heart above them. Thinking about it, Hyunmin excitedly asked if this was his family. The octopus's eyes looked sad. It shook its head in agreement and still made the same sounds. The boy asked him why he was crying, and if he missed them, he should just go to them because he had somehow gotten here. The Kraken began to show him that at night, while he was sleeping, a flying creature had taken him away, but as Hyunmin watched, he didn't understand what he was saying. He apologized, saying that he had no idea what he was saying. Then he picked the creature up and said that in honor of their meeting, he would name it. He asked him what he thought about boop, because that was the sound the octopus made all the time. The octopus's eyes rounded, and it looked very happy. But when it noticed something behind the boy's shoulder, it got scared and jumped on his face. Hyunmin was trying to get the animal off his face, asking if he could get it off, because it was very slippery. Suddenly, the boy heard a familiar voice calling his name. Turning his inquiring gaze, he noticed an excited Tress asking him to give him the octopus. He turned his gaze to look at the frightened creature, asking if he was talking about Bup. Hyunmin asked if he could tell him why he should do it, because Bup was scared. Tress smiled excitedly at the thought of the boy talking as if the Kraken were his pet. The Bup jumped out of the guy's hands and began to make threatening noises. Then the man calmly grabbed him, and no matter how hard he tried to get away, he did not let go. He calmly looked at the creature and said that even if it ran away, it was still an octopus. He closed the animal in a cage and said that he would let it out soon, so let it stay here. The water began to splash loudly, and Hyunmin turned to Tress. The guy said that he didn't like it and asked if it was necessary to put the Kraken in a cage. He noted that Boop likes to chase him, so he can just follow him. Suddenly, Hyunmin's words were cut off. A large tentacle hovered over him, and he looked at it in shock. To Tress's surprise, another Kraken appeared in front of them. This was the Kraken that Calypso was missing. When the giant tentacle was approaching the men, Hyunmin wondered if it was the Kraken. He covered himself with his hand because he thought that the tentacle would fall directly on him, but to his surprise, he felt only droplets of water on his body. When he looked up, he saw Calypso holding the tentacle with his water hand to protect them. Tress was smiling at Calypso, but he just looked at him calmly. The man saw a small octopus in Tress's hands and mentally said that this was the cause of all the fuss. He put his palm to the tentacle and told the Kraken to calm down, because his baby was fine. Calypso turned to Tress, and he answered him with a shudder. Then he released a small octopus, and it quickly jumped out of the cage and jumped to the Kraken. The creatures looked happy when they were able to touch each other. Tress asked the man if he was hurt, and he simply replied in the negative. Hyunmin wondered in his mind if this was it and if it was a good ending. As he exhaled, he smiled and thought that it was good that it was over. He told himself that he needed to pull himself together. When he stood up, he suddenly felt dizzy and very weak. He started to fall, but a strong hand grabbed him, and when he looked up, he saw an excited Calypso asking how he was. Hyunmin quickly pulled away and said, laughing, that he thought it was just the effects of lack of sleep. Then the man took him by the chin to see if he was okay. The boy was surprised by the man's touch. When Calypso got as close as possible, Hyunmin blushed and wondered why he had to get so close. He looked away, saying that he was actually fine. The boy thought that Calypso's hands were big and very warm. Now he understood why it felt so good when he touched him. With these thoughts in mind, Hyunmin began to lean against the man's hand with his eyes closed. Suddenly realizing what he was doing, he asked himself in shock what he had just done. When he looked up, he met the man's surprised expression. Hyunmin wondered what was wrong with his face. He pulled away, saying that it wasn't what he thought, and it was just a misunderstanding. Hyunmin said that he was just tired, so he was a little bit stiff. Trez and the smiling octopus watched this seriously. As the Kraken watched Hyunmin walk away and tell the man not to come any closer, they smiled. Boop made happy noises at the men. Calypso approached Hyunmin and smilingly said that he was listening attentively. The boy wanted to make excuses, but then they were distracted by little Boop, who attacked the boy with glee. Hyunmin was holding the creature, smiling and saying that it scared him, and asked if he had come to say hello. He said that Bup had saved him. Meanwhile, Calypso stood a little behind him and asked if Boop was the Kraken's name. While Boop was hugging Hyunmin's face with a smile, he answered in the affirmative and explained that the creature only says Boop, so he decided to name it that way. Calypso smiled and said that he understood, and found it strange to see a Kraken so affectionate to a human. He unmolded the Kraken from the boy's face and said that he was still not happy to have it so close. He threw Bup back to the big Kraken and told him to go home. Shocked, Hyunmin told him not to leave him like that. When the Kraken grabbed the little one, Calypso said that everything was fine and he was alive. Calypso turned his head to Tress and ordered him to tell Uno and Dos that the problem had been solved and to go to rest. Tress just lowered his head and quietly agreed, but said that he had something to tell him before he did. Then Calypso told him to speak quickly. Tress said he saw it when he was looking for a Kraken cub on the island. He said that Calypso's garden was destroyed. The man said he wasn't sure who did it, but he was looking at Hyunmin, hinting that it could be him. The boy looked at Tress's eyes, remembering that they were full of fury like when they first met. He swallowed hard, wondering why he was looking at him. Calypso just lowered his head and said that he would go check on him and thanked Tress. Calypso grabbed Hyunmin's hand and pulled him along. The boy was shocked and asked what was happening and whether he thought he had done it. He was thinking that one mistake and he would die. Hyunmin walked behind the man and said to him that it was not like that and that he did not do it. The man said he didn't even know where the garden was. Calypso told him to calm down and just follow him without turning around. Hyunmin looked at the man excitedly and calmly agreed. Back in their lair, the sisters asked Tress if he thought everything had gone according to plan. Tress said that he was not sure, but that it was enough for now, and Uno asked if that meant he would try to do something else. He turned to his sister and said that if he hadn't planned to finish the job, he wouldn't have started it. The Temple of Olympus. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, was surprised and asked if Calypso had brought a man into their world. The goddess of the hearth, Hestia, smilingly answered in the affirmative, saying that she had been told this by the nymphs living near Ogygia. She said that there was a commotion in the surrounding seas, so she went to see what was going on. The nymph peered out from behind the trees and saw that Calypso and the man were in a rather serious relationship. Hestia said that when she heard about it, she thought something bad would happen. Now she wondered if everything was fine and there was no reason to worry. A man sitting on a height asked if Calypso had fallen in love with a man. Then Athena abruptly put on her helmet and stood up and said that she had to inform Zeus about it. She said that there had already been problems with Calypso and Odysseus, and now something would definitely go wrong. The man was determined not to let this happen, so he ordered the girls to stop. They looked at him, and he said that before telling his father, he could first reconnoiter the situation. He smiled and said that when he found out something, he would tell them. This man was the messenger of the gods, Hermes. Calypso picked up the mangled flower, thinking that the garden had been destroyed to the ground. Hyunmin stood behind him, thinking that the man had been upset for a long time. He wondered if he should intervene before it got worse. The boy decided not to touch the man. He thought about how the place was destroyed and there were only ruins left. He wondered who could have done this. Calypso stood up and began to approach the boy, and when he was close enough, he began to repeat that, as he had said before, it was not his doing. The man put his fist to the boy's face, and the boy clenched his fist. Then Calypso said that he was not going to beat him for the garden, so he should just open his eyes. When Hyunmin opened his eyes, he saw a small box in front of him. Then Calypso told him to open it. He asked what was inside, and if it was some kind of Pandora's box, and if anything would happen if he opened it. He became very cautious. Calypso exhaled a smile and said that he had been very brave, but had become cowardly in just a couple of days. Then he took the box and opened it and saw a ring with a green stone. He looked at it and asked if it was a ring. Then Calypso told him to put it on his finger. Hyunmin asked in surprise and wondered in his mind if he could really accept it. He scratched his neck with his hand as he thought about whether to put the ring on. Then Calypso took his hand and put the ring on his finger. When the man did this, Hyunmin's heart pounded and he thought about how he felt as if he was proposing to him. Calypso said it was lucky because the ring was his size. He said that it would have been better if the garden had been intact, but he didn't care because the most important things were intact. Hyunmin wondered in his mind if this meant that he didn't suspect him. He asked if he wanted to show him this. Calypso closed the box and said that it was exactly like that. He said that this ring was created from a piece of jewelry inlaid with his soul, and he kept it deep down, but it was of no use. Calypso said that he knew the whereabouts of the person who wore the ring. He said that today, dangerous situations constantly happen when they are not together. The man pointed to the ring and said that he should wear it regularly, and that way he would know where he was. Hyunmin looked at the ring and thought that if it was a piece of jewelry inlaid with his soul, he could see it as him taking care of him. As he looked at it, he thought that it looked very expensive because the stone was large and heavy. He wondered in his mind what if it was worth 1,000 or tens of thousands. Then the guy thought that if he lost this ring, he would be finished. So he held out the ring, saying that it was a bit too much and he could not accept it, so let the man take it. When Calypso asked him in surprise, he replied that by wearing the ring everywhere, he might lose it and he wouldn't be able to pay for it. Hyunmin said he didn't want him to make him pay with his body. Since ancient times, all such situations have ended with the debtor being enslaved. Calypso smilingly said that it was incredible and he hadn't even thought of it. Then he said he hoped he would lose it. The excited boy said that was why he didn't want to wear it. They started arguing because Calypso was ordering him to put it on and Hyunmin was saying no. Then the angry boy stepped up to the man, objecting again and again. When he noticed this closeness, he turned his head away, repeating that he did not want to be dressed. Suddenly, Calypso grabbed his hand and then put his other hand on the back of the boy's head, pulling him closer to him and kissing him gently. While their lips were intertwined, Hyunmin was shivering and thinking that he couldn't breathe. When he pulled away from the man to breathe in, he blushed heavily and put his hand over his lips. He asked what it was. Calypso said, smiling, that he was very stubborn, so he decided to use this tactic and asked if he liked it. The man said that he could repeat it once or twice more if he didn't put on the ring. Hyunmin quickly put it on and pointed to his hand to indicate that he was already wearing it. Suddenly, Hermes caught his eye. He said it was cute and explained that he had come to make sure he wasn't being slandered, but as it turned out, the rumors were true. Calypso looked up in surprise at the man, who smiled back and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Calypso and Hermes were sitting at a table. I asked him when it started. Calypso calmly replied that it was probably the third day. Hermes was surprised and said that he thought it had been several years since the last time. He asked why he let the rumor reach Olympus so quickly and thought it was sad. The man said that he also thought that he had not forgotten his past love, what was so dead in the forest that he had drawn a man here. Calypso said he heard his voice. He said that, as he had said, after Odysseus left him, he had not heard any stories or songs about himself from people who passed by, but Hyunmin had talked about him. Smiling, Calypso asked if he knew what the boy had said. Hyunmin hid behind the wall and watched the men talking and thought about the guy saying that he had no friends and calling him a liar. He wondered what they were talking about and thought that he might hear something from here. Calypso was the first one to smile and say that he said he was terrible because he had held a man captive for several years and said he would like to escape too. Hermes said it was very similar to a book describing him as a man possessed by God and said it was called The Odyssey. He asked, popping grapes into his mouth, what was the point of a book in which half of the text was false? Calypso said that nothing could be done because human nature is such that they believe what they want to believe and see what they want to see. He looked away, saying that Hermes probably thought he was disappointed to hear those words after so many years of silence. But then he got angry at Calypso. He said he didn't want anyone to know. Then Hermes said he was the same as always and asked if that meant he hadn't forgotten Odysseus that easily. Calypso was a little quiet and said that he had been thinking about it a lot lately. Listening to this, Hyunmin thought that the hero Calypso fell in love with at first sight was Odysseus. He remembered when he heard that name. He thought that this was the only person Calypso couldn't forget for a long time, and they had been together on this island for 7 long years. It was a time the boy knew nothing about. Hyunmin put his hand over his mouth, thinking that the man had someone he couldn't forget, and that meant that the reason he cared so much about him was because he needed an outlet. The guy assumed that he was being used somehow, but he hadn't imagined that it would be like this. Remembering the ring, he thought that perhaps it had once belonged to Odysseus. Guillaume closed his eyes and said that he should end the relationship. The man said that fortunately Zeus doesn't know anything yet, but if the Olympus already knows, then it's only a matter of minutes until it goes further. He said that if he hid Hyunmin, they would find him and send him back to the human world. Hearing this, Hyunmin mentally asked again. Then he wondered if he was dead. Then he came out from behind the column and asked why they didn't tell him about it first. Calypso stood up in surprise to address the boy, and Hermes just watched. Calypso approached him, asking how much he had heard. Then Hyunmin said that he had asked first and asked why he had hidden from him that he could go home. The man continued to approach and said that he did not intend to hide it. The guy asked him again and said that he was having a good time watching him get scared and nervous. He said that, for example, last night he stayed up all night because his head hurt like it was going to explode. As Hyunmin took off the ring, he said that it was good that he could now get rid of it. Calypso was surprised to see the guy throwing the ring away right in front of him. Hyunmin said that he didn't need it and he could take it back, and then he turned around and walked away, ignoring Calypso's voice. After that, the man walked over to the ring and picked it up off the ground. Meanwhile, Hermes was thinking that he was a very brave man. Then he said with a smile that he must have said something unnecessary because everyone's mood had somehow deteriorated. Hermes looked at Calypso and asked if he should follow him. Hyunmin walked through some grass, thinking that who would have known that being someone's replacement was so hurtful and painful. He wiped away the tears that spontaneously flowed down his face and thought that he wanted to fall underground. Suddenly, Tress's attention was drawn to him, and he asked Hyunmin where he was going. When the boy looked up to address the man, he said that he looked very thoughtful. Tress said that he was sure he had no one to tell about his thoughts and suggested that he could tell him if he wanted to. Hyunmin thought carefully about what Calypso had said. The man said that a person cannot leave this place without the help of the inhabitants of this realm. The boy thought that if he could persuade at least one creature from here, he would be able to return. Then he turned to Tress, and remembering that he had said that he felt guilty about it, he asked if he needed help. Could he come to him? Tress said he didn't know if his attitude toward him changed after that. Hyunmin said that he could assure him that he was not the one who had destroyed the garden, so he asked him to help him once. He thought that maybe if Tress agreed, he could help him. Then Tress said he would decide after listening to him. He asked what had happened to make him decide to come to him. Hyunmin thought about a place where there was no Calypso, where he had everything he was used to. He said he wanted to go back home to where he came from. Tress was surprised to hear this and thought that something must have happened between them. He said that it was a rather difficult request. When Hyunmin heard this, he lowered his head and said that he was probably right. He thought that it was understandable because Tress was serving Calypso, so he wouldn't be able to help him. Then Tress smiled and said that he hadn't said it was impossible. Calypso looked at the ring in his hand for a few seconds and then clenched his fist and told him to forget it, because if he followed him now, he would only get angrier. The man said that he had nowhere to go anyway. Hermes asked him, smiling, if it wasn't because he couldn't turn away from him. Calypso asked if anyone besides him knew about Hyunmin. Hermes said that only Athena and Hestia did. He said that, by the way, Athena didn't let him tell Zeus about them, but a tongue-tied nymph saw them kiss, so as he said, it was only a matter of time before the rumors reached Olympus. Calypso looked at him and said that this meant that he had been sent here to watch over him. Hermes smiled and said that he was a messenger of the gods, but that he should not be sad, for he had come here first of all because he was his friend. The gods of Olympus no longer interfere in human affairs. Hermes said that his father did not force those who were not part of Olympus to take this vow, but that it was important that everyone obeyed this order, so he could not make an exception for Calypso. He advised his friend to drop the idea. Calypso ignored Hermes and started walking away. When Hermes asked him where he was going, he replied that he was going to look for Hyunmin and told him not to follow him. Meanwhile, Hyunmin exclaimed in surprise. Tres was flying in the form of a bird, holding his hands. The boy was delighted to be flying, even though it was not very comfortable, and he felt like a rabbit caught by an eagle. Hyunmin thought it was a small price to pay for returning to Earth. The boy looked up and asked if he could really return to himself after eating the fruit and asked what it was called. Tres told him that it was a lotus, a holy fruit that grows only on the island of the Lotophagi. In Greek mythology, a lotus was a person who, by eating the fruit of the lotus, forgot about the past. The man said that once he ate it, he would feel a little dizzy, but when he left, he would be able to return to his world, and it would feel like waking up from a dream. Hyunmin thanked Tres, saying that he was putting himself in harm's way for him. The man first looked at the boy and then looked up and asked him directly if he wanted to see his family. He said he had someone like that too. It happened a long time ago, but Tres hasn't forgotten about it. The men said that they had finally gotten the gold and couldn't believe that they had found siren cubs. They said they could not work for a year if they sold them and asked where the nearest market was. That day, the pirates brought them to their ship, which was sailing near Ogygia. That day, Tres met Calypso for the first time. He heard the pirates shouting, asking what was going on, and saying that someone had been leaked on board. The ship caught fire and many people died, and that's when Calypso appeared. He went down to where Tres, Uno, and Dos were sitting. He ordered the boy to stand up and held out his hand to him and told him to come with him. Tres had not forgotten, because he had saved him and his sisters when they were defenseless. Calypso became his hero. Tres promised himself that even if he had to hide his feelings, he would not reveal them, but instead would always be on Odysseus's side and would thank him for his kindness. So even when Odysseus was with him, he was happy to see the man happy. Now he was flying and thinking that humans are weak, and if Hyunmin stays with Calypso, he will definitely destroy it in any way possible. He mentally told him that if he wanted to blame someone, he should blame himself for being born human. The boy thought that it was someone close to Tres, and maybe he understood who it was. Hyunmin thought that maybe it was his sisters or Calypso, but his thoughts were interrupted by Tres saying that they were almost there and pointing to a piece of land and saying that it was the Lotus Island. Hermes sat exhaling and said that Calypso and Odysseus did not have such childish quarrels, and that it was probably true what they say, the older you get, the more you behave like a child. Suddenly the man noticed some movement nearby and jumped up and looked over. Meanwhile, Calypso spotted Uno and Dos and asked if they had seen Hyunmin. Uno looked surprised and said that she hadn't seen him since the morning. Dos asked if they should go look for him. Calypso said there was no need and he would look for him himself. He noticed that Tres was not there and asked the maids where he was. Uno tried to say something while looking at her sister, but Dos took the initiative and said that Tres had said he would go hunting in the evening. Calypso asked in surprise, saying that he thought he had already gone recently. A worried Uno said that maybe the Kraken incident had disturbed him because he wanted to recuperate. Dos agreed, saying that Tres looked tired afterwards. Hearing this, Calypso turned around and told the girls to get some rest. After he left, Dos asked her sister if they were in trouble again. Uno wiped the sweat from her face and said that at this rate, Tres would drive her to her grave. Lotus Island. Hyunmin held a fruit in his hand and said that it looked like a jujube, a medicinal plant. Tres said that he had a lotus fruit in his hand. The boy looked at his hand and wondered if he ate it, he would really come home. Then he thought that it meant that this was the final goodbye to Calypso as well. Tres turned to Hyunmin and asked if something was wrong. The boy started waving in the negative and said that everything was fine. He squeezed his eyes shut and wondered what was the point of worrying about all this now. He mentally called Calypso a pervert and told himself to stop thinking about it. Then he began to bite off a piece of the fruit. Tres threw back his hair, thinking that the only thing left to do was to get out of there unnoticed. But suddenly a smiling Hermes came out of the bushes and greeted him. Tres was very frightened by this sudden appearance of the man and asked him in shock what he was doing here, and in his mind he wondered what he was doing there in the first place. Hermes scratched the back of his head and asked what he meant, because of course he had stopped by Calypso's. Hermes smiled and said that everyone was here, but he was not, so he decided to look for him. The man asked where he had been all this time and if he had been running errands for Calypso, but then he said that it was unlikely. His gaze turned colder and he looked at Trax intently. Hermes said he thought he was hiding something. Tres was shocked and his heart was pounding, and he wondered if he had been found out. Tres said that of course he wasn't hiding anything, but he swallowed hard, worried. He thought that he simply could not have been exposed and that it was impossible. Then Hermes smiled and asked if he was seeing someone. Tres fell to the ground, and then Hermes said that he was probably right, because he looked worried. Tres, lying on the ground, said that it was because he had scared him. Hermes said he came to ask him about something in general. He told him that he and Calypso were looking for a man and asked if he had seen him. Tres looked away, peeing, and then turned his head and said that he knew nothing about it. Hermes continued to smile and asked if he would swear by the holy waters of the river Styx. The Styx is one of the rivers of Hades that flowed around the underworld 9 times, and the Olympic gods swore by the sacred waters of the Styx. When Tres heard this, he looked at the man coldly without saying a word. God continued to smile with one hand to his forehead and waved with the other, saying that Calypso had spoiled him too much. Tres was angry at the man for treating him like a child. Then he closed his eyes and asked the man not to tell Calypso. Hermes asked what he shouldn't tell, that he had hidden a person from him or that he loved him. Then Tres angrily replied that both options were not to be told. Hermes turned around, while an angry Tres stood behind him and laughing said that he would keep his secret and then asked where the person was. Tres said that he was on the Lotus Island. He said that the man had already eaten the lotus, so even if they found him, it would be too late. As Hermes listened to this, his face grew cold. The lotus fruit was found only on the Lotus Island. It causes such strong hallucinations that after eating it, the creature forgets everything he could remember and everything he wanted. Then there is only one desire: to disappear. Hermes thought about what he had heard, that there was no antidote to this poison. He thought that Tres was being mean. Calypso held an open palm with a ring in it. He was saying Hyunmin's name to it. Suddenly, Hermes appeared behind him and asked if he had found anything. Calypso answered in the negative, saying that he had searched every corner of the island, but it was nowhere to be found. At that moment, Hermes thought that, of course, how can he be found here if he is somewhere else? He turned his head away and said that he had heard the nymph say that she had seen a man on a certain island. Calypso then abruptly approached the man, taking him by the clothes and telling him to tell him quickly where it was. Hermes, smiling, immediately agreed, asking him to just calm down. Meanwhile, Hyunmin wandered around the island asking what he was doing in this place. He mumbled that he didn't remember anything, so the boy broke through the tall grass and headed straight for the edge of the cliff. The guy was already standing on the edge of the cliff so that the stones were already crumbling. His eyes were blank and he could only hear the wind blowing. He slowly closed his eyes and stepped forward, falling down. He was flying very fast, but he felt nothing. Suddenly someone grabbed him. It was Calypso, who stopped right in front of the water, holding the boy in his arms. He looked at him calmly and held him tightly. Calypso brought him to the palace and gently laid him on the couch. Looking at him, the man looked at his clothes and thought that he definitely did not swim there because the clothes were not wet in the slightest. Then he thought that there was someone else missing besides Hyunmin. Then Tres's excited voice was heard, addressing Calypso and asking what had happened. Hermes turned his head to him and pointed to him. Seeing this, Tres stopped and looked inquiringly in his direction. When Calypso noticed Tres, he stood up and walked toward him with a heavy step, coldly addressing him. He stood in front of him and coldly asked if he had anything to tell him. Frightened, Tress stammered and turned to Calypso, not knowing what to say. Then Hermes intervened between them, smiling and telling them to stop because fighting is bad for health. Then Calypso looked at him coldly and said that he was his servant and shouldn't bother him. Hermes was silent for a few seconds and then turned away and smiled and said that the man seemed to be sick and he would see how he was doing while they talked. But Calypso didn't let him do it and quickly went to the boy. Meanwhile, he was trembling with fear. He turned around and headed in the other direction while Hermes watched. Hermes did not take his eyes off Tress when Calypso asked him if he had eaten the lotus fruit. He replied that it was likely, judging by the symptoms. Calypso silently touched him and felt that Hyunmin was cold, and then turned and went to Hermes and said that he needed to visit Apollo, or even Asclepius. Hermes was shocked to hear this. He said that he also understands what can happen if you tell the whole of Olympus about a person, because it is a horror to be held captive. Hermes said that a man in God's world would be frankly bad news for everyone. Calypso looked at the man angrily and swore that he didn't know what other options he had. Then Hermes was silent for a few seconds, and then he put his hand on Calypso's shoulder and told him to calm down and look at the other side. He said that they still had time before he committed suicide. At this point, the man recalled that he thought he had brought this guy here for fun, but now he was beginning to realize that it was more serious. Suddenly, Hermes exclaimed in surprise, saying that he had an idea. Then Calypso, excited, asked if there was any way out. Hermes seemed to absorb the rays of light and said that he knew someone who could help. Then Calypso came up to him and asked him directly to his face who it was and told him to speak quickly. The island of Eeyore. A raven landed on the woman's hand, telling her something. She asked if it was Calypso and asked why. When the raven explained the situation, she said that it was the first time since the incident with Odysseus. She sat smiling and looking at the raven said it sounded like fun, the witch of Circe. Calypso walked forward, approaching Circe's lair. As he stood in front of the entrance, he began to remember how Hermes had said that he could help Circe. Then the man said that he understood that the two were like cats and dogs, but he did not know anyone who could help in this situation better than her. Then Hermes said that now was not the time to be capricious. Walking through the stone corridors, Calypso noticed many bats around him. He stopped when he saw Circe on her stone throne. Then she addressed Calypso in a calm voice and asked him what was wrong. The woman smiled and said that she didn't think she would ever see him again, but something very serious must have happened if he was here. Calypso said coldly that he would be frank with her and asked if she could make an antidote to the lotus fruit. When Circe asked him again, he was silent for a few seconds, and then lowered his head, exhaled, and said that the person he had brought here had eaten him, so he needed an antidote. At first, the woman asked in shock about the man, and then laughing began to tap her hand on the armrest and said that she thought he would never forget about Odysseus, but it finally happened. She leaned over a little and smiled and said that she thought it was love and that everything changes over time. She said that's exactly how it looked to her, and asked what it was like. Calypso lowered his head and said that he hadn't forgotten about it. After a bit of silence, he asked Circe if she had ever thought that her eternal life was meaningless. The woman looked at him questioningly, and then he said that this was exactly how he had felt in recent years. After Odysseus left him, he remembered every day that he was alone. Calypso walked the roads he used to walk with him every day. Remembering Odysseus and the past, he looked up at the sky and into the human world. One day, he heard people talking about him. Then he wondered if there were any other people who knew about him and thought that maybe he should listen a little more. He looked at Hyunmin, and when he said that what the goddess Calypso did was terrible, the man got angry and asked what kind of nonsense he was talking about, and when he said that he would also like to run away in such situations, Calypso got even angrier. While listening to this heartfelt speech, I put my hand to my lips and said that it sounded rude. Waving her hand in denial, she said that he shouldn't think so and that she wasn't taking sides in this matter. Hearing this, the man thought that she had not been asked to do so. Calypso said that this made him very angry, and he felt that all those years he spent in that world had been devalued. That's why he brought him to this world to teach him a lesson, but he enjoyed spending time with the boy. Recalling their kiss, he said that the last time he had such fun was with Odysseus. Eventually, Calypso became greedy and wanted him to be with him. Smiling, Circe said that the woman was a wonderful person because she made Calypso beg her for help. Then the woman asked how he had allowed him to eat the lotus fruit. She grabbed the raven by the throat and looked at him and said that she would have locked him in prison and not let him out. The woman let the raven go and turned her head to Calypso, smiling, and said that she was not completely heartless and would help him. Then she said that life gives nothing for nothing, and Calypso asked what you want to get. He said he would give her whatever she asked for. She asked him if he was serious about giving anything away. Calypso looked up at her and answered in the affirmative. Then Circe smiled and leaned over to say what she wanted. Tres stood on the shore watching the water lapping calmly. Suddenly he heard the voice of Hermes behind him, smiling and calling out to him. Then Tres said that he would prefer to be alone. Hermes smilingly asked him why he did that, because he was just a human being. Tres, speaking of Calypso, said that he just loved people and asked why he even looked at those weaklings. Then Hermes said, smiling, that there was no arguing about tastes. Prez looked to the side and smilingly said that this was not very reassuring. Then Hermes turned to him and said that if you wanted to plot against him, you should have been more cunning, seduce him or flatter him before setting him up. Tres said there was no point in talking about it now. He turned around to leave and said that if he was going to stay here, he would leave. Hermes said that he would be here, and if he felt lonely, he should come. Hearing this, Tres stopped for a second. While Hermes was lying on the ground, Tres came up to him and smilingly said that he seemed to want to leave. Then Tres said that even if he had left, they would still be on the same island. He sat down next to Hermes and said that he wanted to approach the problem in a more mature way and asked why it was so difficult. Hermes asked if this was possible because of who he was. When Tres looked at him, the man said that it is easier to be with those who appreciate you just for your existence, so that everything will change by itself in a good way. Calypso washed his face with water and then took the antidote that was hanging around his neck. Now the man looked different, because his long hair had been cut and even very short. He recalled how Circe gave him the antidote and said that if he didn't wake up in 10 minutes, he would be dead. Then Calypso took the antidote and clenched it in his fist. Did not want to hear the end of this phrase, so he just said that he understood and thanked her. The woman held his hair in her hand and said that you are welcome, especially compared to what he gave her. She said that with this she would have enough magic for 1,000 years. She said that a person is lucky in his heart to be loved by God. She told him to introduce them if everything went well. Calypso turned around and said he would ask him later and said goodbye. Suddenly the woman stopped him and he turned his head to look at her. Then she said that she was rooting for him. After that, Calypso smiled and walked away, hardly thanking her. He knelt over the water and looked at the antidote. Afterwards, he lowered his head, saying that he had rushed when she asked him to give her hair, the source of his strength. He said gloomily that never would have thought that she would ask for his hair. Calypso mentally asked himself what he was doing. He thought it would be hard to go back with what little magic he had left. He had no time to rest, but forcing himself would only hurt his body. An image of Hyun Min lying motionless on the bed appeared in his mind. At that moment, the man thought that he had no time to waste and that if he didn't get there in time, it would be too late. Calypso then took off, mentally asking Hyun Min to hold on. Calypso was flying and his feathers kept falling on the water. Then he saw that he could already see the island in front of him and had to hold on a little longer. One of his wings suddenly shrank, and he staggered and began to fall into the water. The man was soaked, but still managed to get back into the air. Breathing heavily, Calypso held the antidote in his hand and looked at the island in the distance, thinking that there was only a little bit left. He squeezed the small bottle tightly, but then his hand let go of it exhaustedly and he flew down with his eyes closed. Calypso flew straight through the water, but suddenly landed on something soft. He opened his eyes and looked inquiringly and saw Bupa in front of him. When he sat up, he saw the Kraken's eyes and smilingly thanked him. Then Boop noticed the man's missing hair and the bottle hanging around his neck. Calypso looked at the bottle, picked it up, and said that Hyun Min was sick, and he needed to get back to him as soon as possible with the antidote. He asked if he could help him. Bub imagined that the boy was telling him how bad he felt and begging him to help him because he couldn't live without him. This fantasy made the little creature's eyes water. Then he climbed up on the head of the big Kraken and pointed straight ahead and made a loud, decisive sound. The Kraken's eyes lit up and they rushed to the island. Calypso, meanwhile, looked straight ahead and thought that he was very grateful, but he felt a little uneasy. He thought back to the moment when he had thrown the little octopus back and wondered if it was some kind of karma. Listening to Hermes, the man said that he seemed to have a lot of experience. Hermes laughed and said that of course he was. He was married and had children. When Tress heard this, he looked at him in surprise and asked him a question. Hermes said, laughing, that they didn't believe him until they saw them with their own eyes. He asked if Tress didn't believe him either. He turned away and smiled and answered in the negative, saying that he believed him, but he knew in his mind that he believed the opposite. He put his hand to his chin and said that he now realized that he knew nothing about Hermes. Hermes smiled and told him to ask him anything he wanted and he would tell him. Tress was silent for a while and then asked him excitedly if he had ever had a relationship with a man. But without answering the question, Hermes abruptly stood up, surprised, asking if it was Calypso. A man was walking towards them, and when Tress saw him, he turned to him in surprise, talking about his hair. Hermes said that he didn't look good and asked how he was doing. Then he pointed to the little creature and said that he had brought something interesting. Then Calypso said that he was fine and asked what was wrong with Hyunmin. Hermes, playing with the octopus, said that his condition had not changed since he left. When Calypso heard this, he looked at Bup and asked if he would come with him. When he nodded, they headed for the palace, and the men remained standing, watching them. Hermes watched and said that Calypso had changed. Then he turned his head to Tress and asked what he wanted to tell him. Tress lowered his excited gaze and was silent for a few seconds, which he clenched his fist and apologized that he had forgotten. Calypso walked into the room where Hyunmin was lying. He walked over to the bed and jumped off his shoulder and onto the boy, who knelt down. He carefully took off the bottle and looked at the boy, saying that he was here. He touched the boy's chin and then opened the bottle and began to pour the antidote into his mouth. The little octopus looked at him in surprise. After that, the man gently lifted Hyunmin's head and opened his lips and kissed him, passing the liquid. Calypso kissed him and mentally begged him to open his eyes. Meanwhile, Hyunmin stood in a white space. He looked shocked and purred inquiringly. He asked if someone was there, and suddenly, when he turned his head, he saw a door and asked what they were doing there. While he was looking at them, he heard a voice asking if he wanted to leave. Hongmin turned toward the voice and asked who it was. He tried to look closely, but because of the very thick fog, he could not see the man's face. Suddenly, his foot began to fall through the water, and he asked in shock what the hell was going on. The man told him not to worry because he was safe for now. Hearing the last words, he mentally asked again. Scratching the back of his head, the man smiled and asked if they knew each other because the man was treating him as if they were friends. When the fog cleared, he saw himself in front of him. After Tress apologized and said that he had forgotten, Hermes smilingly said that sometimes there was no point in rushing. He said that he could ask when he remembered. After that, Hermes asked what he would do if the man woke up. He said that if Calypso found out, he would be in trouble. The trust turned to him and said that he was ready to be punished, because after all, Calypso was the one who saved him and his sisters without asking for anything in return. He looked down and said he would not run away. Hermes said, smiling, that he was hopeless. Tress looked in his direction and asked why he was laughing, because he was serious. Then Hermes said with a shrug that he and Calypso were very similar because they were both very loyal. After Calypso handed over the antidote to Hyunmin, he gently laid his head back down and looked at him. He looked concerned and continued to hold the boy's hand without letting go for a second. Hyunmin looked at his copy, who was smiling in surprise. He then turned around and thought that he couldn't remember his own face and wondered what was wrong with him. He mentally wondered if he was dreaming, and if so, he had to wake up someday. Then the guy turned to him and said that this world is his subconscious and it protects him from the pain of tragedy and despair so he can function normally on the outside. The copy said it was to go through the door or not. He warned him not to forget that he was here because of what happened outside. Then a surprised Hyunmin asked what happened outside. The water splashed his leg again and he looked down in shock and said that the water level was rising and asked if it was normal. Then the copy said that when the water reaches the top of the door, it will be over. Then Hyunmin asked what he meant by end up. The cop said that was exactly what he was talking about and he wouldn't stop him whether he left or not. After these words, he first lowered his head looking at the water and then turned it to the door. He watched and wondered in his mind why he was nervous. He felt as if he would be very sorry if he stayed here. Then he asked what would happen if he stayed. Wopia said that one thing was clear. He and the copy would meet their last moments here. As Hyomin thought about this in shock, the water rose even more. Looking down, he wondered when the water had reached this level. He was shocked by the speed of it. Calypso continued to sit next to Hyunmin, holding his hand and putting it to his lips. Suddenly his eyes rounded and he thought in denial, saying that the boy's body was getting cold. The little octopus continued to sit next to him with tears in his eyes. Then Calypso turned to Hyunmin and squeezed his hand. He said he had something to tell the boy, so let him come back. The man's gaze was very excited, and he wasn't just telling Hyunmin, he was begging him to come back. Suddenly, Hyunmin's heart thumped loudly and he put his hand to his chest and asked in surprise what had just happened. He said he felt a warm sensation, but he didn't understand what it was. Hyunmin clenched his fist and turned to the copy and began to mumble that he had to leave. The copy leaned over and asked him what he had said, because he couldn't hear him. Then Hyunmin grabbed his hand and told him firmly that he had to go back. He said he had to get out of here. The cop said that of course it was all good and asked why he suddenly grabbed his arm. He said that it was a bit awkward. Then Hyunmin asked again and said that he wanted to leave with him because the guy said that he was Hyun. The guy said that they should go together, because if they were alone, it would be sad. When the water rose even higher, Hyunmin pulled the copy along with him as he headed for the door. The copy looked at their hands and said as he trailed behind that if they left together, he would remember everything, including his worst memories. Hyunmin said that he didn't care and that they would just go outside and he would find out for himself. Copy said that he might regret it. Then he turned his head to him and said that he would have plenty of time for that later. The water had already risen to their waists and it was becoming more and more difficult to walk, but they were already near the door. When the door began to open, the water was almost up to their necks. Hyunmin reached out to the causal door and thought that there was only a little bit left. As he touched the door, he smiled, thinking about what he had done. Hyunmin was glad he had made this choice. When he turned back to the copy, he saw a smiling face, but when the door opened wider, he turned his gaze there. Calypso continued to hold his hand and Boop looked at it sadly. Suddenly, the little octopus turned his gaze to the boy and noticed that he was grimacing and making some sounds. When the man noticed this, he excitedly touched his face and called him by name. Hyunmin opened his eyes to see Calypso in front of him, but the image was still a little blurry. The man was asking how he was doing. After a few clicks, his vision cleared and he turned to the man in surprise. When Calypso heard his name on the boy's lips, he hugged him. He leaned against the boy and closed his eyes, saying that he had been waiting for him. The man thanked God that he was here. Hyunmin was surprised at the sudden movement, but then his eyes relaxed and he felt calm. Hermes turned his head sharply, humming inquiringly. Trez looked at him and asked what was wrong. The man replied that he thought the man was awake and asked if he wanted to see him. Trez answered in the negative. Then Hermes looked at him and smiled. Then the man turned around and said that he would visit him himself and that he should stay here and try not to cry. When Trez heard this, he said angrily that he wasn't going to cry, but then he turned his head and smiled and thanked him. Hermes flew to the palace and saw Calypso coming out of it. He watched and scratched his cheek, wondering why he was pushing so hard and if something had gone wrong. He hid behind a column, looking at Calypso so that he would not notice him. Meanwhile, Calypso looked down and exhaled, saying that if Hyunmin were immortal, so would he. Then Hermes came out and stood behind the man and addressed him. When Calypso heard him, he returned a surprised look. Hermes then coldly asked him what he had just said and if he had heard him correctly. Calypso turned his head to the side and said that it didn't matter, so the man didn't have to worry about it. Then he asked about Tress. Hermes said that he came alone if that was what he meant, and that he was not going to do anything else. Calypso said he understood, and then there was silence between them for a few seconds. Then Hermes broke the silence and asked if they could discuss what he had said, as he was concerned as a friend. He took off his hat and said that he knew he had done it to help the man, but to give up his strength to cure the boy was too much. Hermes said that Hyunmin is not an Odysseus. He doesn't have supernormal powers because he's just an ordinary person. Calypso remained silent, and then Hermes asked if he couldn't send him away. Why not give him nectar and ambrosia? Calypso was surprised to hear this. Hermes affirmed that it was the food of the gods which could make anyone immortal. He said that he was talking about this particular nectar with ambrosia. The man smiled and said that he didn't know what would happen next, but if the boy ate it, he would not be able to return to the human world, but then he would live forever. After that, he asked Calypso what he would do. Hyunmin was lying in bed, screaming loudly. Bup, who was standing next to him, flinched. Then the shocked boy asked what happened to Calypso. Thinking back to the moment he woke up, he wondered why Calypso had that face. And when he remembered how the man had hugged him, he asked him in shock why he had done it. He looked up at the ceiling and said that the man's hair was shorter, and he looked like something terrible had happened to him. After that, Hyunmin smiled and asked if it was possible that it was because of him. He looked at the octopus and then turned his head to the other side and said that it was impossible, because he was just a toy that a man likes to play with from time to time. The boy's eyes grew sadder, and he said that Calypso was angry with him before he tried to run away with Tress. He recalled the words that the copy had said to him that he might regret it. Crying, he said that he now understood what he was talking about. Meanwhile, the little octopus poked its tentacle into the boy's cheek, making peculiar sounds. Hyunmin turned his head to him with a smile and said that he was glad to see him again. Bup seemed to glow with happiness when he heard this. He hugged the boy, and the boy hugged him back, saying that he understood. He said it was not very convenient not to be able to move his own body. He could move freely only what was above his chest, and everything below was paralyzed. A little earlier, Calypso told him that he had recently taken the antidote, so he needed to wait a little longer until he was fully recovered. The man said that from now on, if he needed anything, he should tell him. Hyunmin asked about the antidote and said that animals and plants in this world are something. Then he thought it meant that what Tress gave him was poison. The boy thought that maybe Tress had been ordered to do so, but Calypso looked really concerned. Remembering how the man had hugged him, he blushed. He turned his head away and mumbled that he had just imagined it. He said it would be nice if it turned out to be true. Bob thought about what the boy was saying for a while. Suddenly he exclaimed in approval and jumped out of bed and ran out. The octopus was walking and thinking about the love between Calypso and Hyunmin. When the boy turned his head, he noticed that the creature was gone. Meanwhile, Hermes and Calypso stood silently. Calypso thought carefully about this difficult decision because it was very important. But then he finally agreed, telling Hermes to bring him nectar and ambrosia. Hermes brought what Calypso asked for. Putting everything in front of him, he told him to keep his order. Sitting opposite him, Hermes said that the main thing was that he should not forget that a person should eat both ragweed and nectar. When the man saw Calypso's gloomy face, he asked what was wrong with him. Calypso said that nothing was wrong, but that he had a lot of thoughts now that he was in front of it. Hermes turned around and said that he could do whatever he wanted and could think some more, but he didn't have much time left. Calypso agreed and thanked him. Hyunmin whined about how he knew Calypso would be like this. He recalled how at night, when he told his husband that he was thirsty, he would just mumble in agreement but do nothing, and the same when he said he was hungry. He said that he shouldn't expect such actions, but he hugged him so tightly. This confused Hyunmin, and he said that he could have taken better care of him. He asked him what he was thinking. Suddenly he tried to raise his hand. It trembled but still moved. When he raised it, he smiled proudly. The guy looked at his hand and said he had an idea. Calypso walked in on Hyunmin and said that he had brought him some food, but all he heard in response was silence. As he approached the boy, he turned to him excitedly and put his hand on him. Suddenly, Hyunmin grabbed his hand and turned around. Then the man said that his paralysis was gone. The boy turned his face to him, and then the man saw tears in the corners of the boy's eyes. Hyunmin turned to Calypso again and asked him to help him. He pulled the man over so that he was on top of him. When Calypso hovered over him, he looked at him with a surprised look. His cheeks were red and he was quite close. The slightly embarrassed man swallowed loudly and asked how he could help him. Then Hyunmin asked if he could tell him if he would do it. Calypso looked at him and asked if the boy was like that because of the medication. He touched his temple and said that he had already told him that he should tell him if he needed anything. The man leaned a little lower and asked again what he could do for him. Hyunmin looked away, and after a few seconds of silence, he looked at Calypso again and asked if he would spend the night with him. Calypso's heart beat loudly, and his hand, which was sitting next to his head, moved to his own. He put the man's hand to his lips and asked if he wanted to. Calypso blushed even more and remained silent. Unexpectedly, he moved his hand to Hyunmin's neck. Then the man leaned down and gently kissed his neck just below his ear. This made him very embarrassed. Then Calypso raised his head and asked him if he understood what he was asking him to do. Hearing this, the boy's heart beat fast, his eyes rounded, and he blushed, thinking that he had not expected such a violent reaction. Then he said he just wanted them to sleep together and asked if he would sleep next to him. Calypso said that he didn't mind and leaned into the boy's ear and whispered something. Hyunmin blushed even more. The guy asked a question and Calypso said that it was quite fast. Then Hyunmin said it was a normal biological reaction. Calypso smiled and said that they would talk about it after he recovered, but now it was more important to eat something. When he looked over, he saw that the carafe and plate were empty. Not far away, a happy Bup was sitting, and it was obvious that he was the culprit behind the food. I looked at him and asked where he was. The octopus exhaled happily and shouted as usual. Boop felt some cold energy next to him. He opened one eye, smiling, and looked to the side to see an angry Calypso. He was clenching his fists and coldly asking if he had eaten everything. When the octopus saw such a cold mood, he was frightened. Then he held out the ring in his tentacle. With tears in his eyes, he tried to explain that he had been searching everywhere for it in order to unite their hearts. He was very tired because of his hard search. When Hyunmin saw this, he said that Calypso made Bup cry and asked him what he'd eaten. After that, he went back to the octopus and asked where he had found it and calmed the animal down. Calypso reached for the ring and took it, saying that he had found the ring. He looked at Hyunmin through the ring. Then the boy extended his hand to him. Calypso looked at him and asked if he wanted him to put it on, and the boy nodded in the affirmative. The man stared at him silently for a few seconds, and then smiled, lowering his head. He took Hyunmin's hand and put a ring on his ring finger, saying that he had changed since he got sick. Calypso said he thought it was the love effect of the antidote. Hyunmin asked what happened to him and why he cut his hair. He asked if it was possible that the man had done it because of him. Calypso immediately answered in the affirmative. The boy looked at him admiringly, asking if it was true, and the man replied that he was a simpleton. Hyunmin covered his head and asked if he could pretend not to notice for once. Calypso then stood up and told him to wait, and that he would bring the food back. Then the man took the empty dishes and went out. The boy looked at the ring and remembered that Calypso had whispered in his ear that he was not going to just sleep. Remembering this, the boy's face immediately turned red. He covered it with his hand and said that he could not believe that the man had said that. Putting his hand to his lips, he said he didn't mind. Bup next to him exclaimed, drawing attention to himself. Then the guy patted him on the head, telling him to ignore it. Hermes was sitting on a tree laughing and saying that who would have thought that this creature would steal such a precious thing? He said that now he would live forever without knowing why. Wiping away his tears of laughter, Hermes told Calypso not to worry because he would just get more. Then Calypso replied in the negative, saying that it was not necessary. Hermes's face became more serious and he asked why. Calypso said that there was something more important he wanted to ask him about. Hyunmin looked at the food Calypso brought him and exclaimed that it looked delicious. He smilingly thanked him for the food and started eating. Calypso sat next to him and asked him, smiling, that he could stop spoon-feeding him now. He noted that he had recovered quickly. Dropping the fork and smiling, he said that his hands were suddenly numb. Calypso laughed and said that he was incredible and picked up the fork and began to feed the boy, who obediently opened his mouth. Suddenly, Calypso turned to Hyunmin and asked if he ever wanted to go back to where he used to live. He thought about it and said that he didn't know, because there were some people he missed there, but he was fine now. He then turned his gaze to the man and asked why he was interested in this. Calypso simply said that he understood and handed the food to the boy again. The boy looked at him questioningly, but meekly ate the piece. Calypso looked at him silently, resting his head on his hand. He recalled Hermes asking him what he wanted. Then Calypso lowered his head and said that since everything was changing, it seemed he had to think more before making a decision. He said he understood that it was not easy, but he got down on one knee and asked if he could buy him as much time as possible. On the way down, Hermes asked me thoughtfully. He repeated that, as he had said, it would be difficult. Then he came down and stood in front of Calypso and said he would try. He turned to the man and said that he might not get as much time as he needed. After that, Hermes leaned down and put his hand on his friend's shoulder and said that he hoped he would make the right choice. Now Hyunmin was talking to him about his hair and asked him why he cut it. Calypso looked at him calmly and said directly that he had already said it was because of him. The guy turned away and asked again, saying that he didn't think he was serious. The man said he also did it because he wanted to change his style. After thinking about it, Hyunmin said that his hair was shaggy. Looking at him, the man said that he looked very attractive, but also a little untidy. Hyunmin asked him if he wanted him to trim it a little, and the man was surprised to hear that he would do it. The guy was holding scissors and a comb, saying that although he was unemployed now, he had good skills and had won competitions. Calypso then asked what a contest was. Hyunmin explained that it meant he was a recognized master. Smiling, he said that the tools were not very good, but a true master never puts the blame on the tools. The guy said that he could trust him. Calypso laughed and said that he trusted the guy with his hair. He told him to cut off as little as possible. Hyunmin said that his request was a law for him, and it was literally a matter of life and death, because hair adorns a person. So the guy started cutting the hair, carefully cutting off each strand and combing it. When he wanted to trim the front, he stood in front of Calypso and took him by the face and told him to look at him. It so happened that their faces were quite close that Hyunmin blushed and his heart started to race. He started to cut it off and said that he didn't need to look so closely. Calypso said he was only looking because he asked him to. Calypso sat still and thought about how he thought he had been looked after by others before, but this felt different. His face turned red and he closed his eyes and wondered if it had always felt so good to be cared for. Hyunmin took off his cloak and held out a mirror, smiling, saying that everything was ready and that he should look. When the man looked at himself, Hyunmin asked how he liked it. Calypso said that it was beautiful and he had to admit that he had talent. The man laughed and said that he could praise him as much as he wanted. Hyunmin said that he was already handsome, and now he had an incredible hairstyle. Calypso knelt down in front of the boy and took his hand and kissed it gently. Raising his head, he smilingly said that he had an incredible talent and thanked him. The guy blushed deeply and turned his head away and began to cough. He said ashamedly that if he was so grateful, he should give him something. Calypso laughed and asked if he really did. Then Hyunmin turned his head and noticed the man's face appearing right in front of his eyes. Calypso approached and whispered that he would give him something and that he should close his eyes. Then the boy squeezed his eyes tightly shut and their lips intertwined. Olympus. Zeus is the god of thunder and lightning. A strong lightning bolt struck the palaces of Zeus and stretched around. A man was angrily clutching his spear, and small discharges were spreading around him. He sat still and only said the name of Hermes in a cold tone. Hermes lay there thinking about how Calypso had asked him to buy him as much time as possible. He wondered how he was supposed to do it, because he had promised the man, so he had to at least try. He recalled how Trez had told him that he was ready to be punished, because Calypso was the one who had saved him and his sisters without asking for anything in return. Then Trez called him his savior. Recalling this, Hermes stood up and rubbed his hands together, saying that everyone was very dramatic and he was even a little lonely. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. At first, he sat still for a few seconds, but he had to react somehow. He turned his head with a curious giggle and wondered if he was imagining things. But when he opened his eyes and looked back, he shouted loudly. Hermes was sitting on his knees before Zeus, sweating anxiously. Angry, Zeus spoke to him, saying that someone had seen him stealing ambrosia and nectar. Someone nearby whispered that they knew he had always had a knack for such things. The man reflected on the fact that no one was there when he stole it, and he did not understand who could have seen it, because he thought there was not a soul there. Averting his excited gaze, he asked about the theft and said that he had no idea what they were talking about. When he was struck by lightning, he seriously said that he was bored. Hermes said that he decided to feed the baby Kraken with this food. Hearing this, Zeus asked again. Then Hermes said that he wondered if he fed the Kraken with ragweed nectar. Would it live forever? I heard a murmur from the side, people discussing that only humans had ever tasted this food. Someone said that he had been so bored lately that if something didn't happen, he would die of boredom. The girl next to him said that he was right, because no matter what reason she was called to have fun. Someone else agreed and said that they could not go down to the human world whenever they wanted. Shocked, Zeus asked if this was true. The man sitting in the chair said that if there hadn't been a celebration for so long, then perhaps it was time to start one. Hearing this, the gods around them exclaimed happily. Then Hermes smilingly turned to his father and asked what about him, and Zeus ordered him to be released. Hermes bowed to his father and thanked him for it. Then Zeus said that he was lucky this time, and his son agreed with him. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, stood behind the wall and watched this seriously. Calypso and Hyunmin walked along the grass holding hands. Calypso smilingly said that it wasn't long until he was fully recovered and that he was already walking. He asked if it was true and said that he might be able to run soon. But suddenly he stumbled and started to fall. Calypso stopped him from doing so by grabbing him by the waist and holding him up. The man smiled warmly and told him to concentrate on walking. Hyunmin thanked him excitedly, thinking that he was surprised. Opening his eyes, he looked at the man's neck. With a reddened face, he began to sniff, thinking that he was so close that he could even smell him. At this point, Calypso continued to hold the guy and asked if they were going back. Embarrassed, Hyunmin replied in the negative and said that it could pass, so they would go somewhere else. He mentally banged his head against the wall, asking himself what he was doing and why he was sniffing, if he was a pervert. So they continued walking, holding hands. Hyunmin turned to the man and asked him what he liked about him. Calypso looked at the guy with reddened cheeks in surprise and hummed inquiringly. Then the man turned his head away, saying that he hadn't thought about it. He said that he liked the fact that he never listened to him and did what he wanted. He also said that he was weak and couldn't hide his emotions. For the boy, all these words were like stones falling on his head and hard to bear. Hyunmin was smiling angrily, saying that he hadn't said anything good and that he could say something about him like that too. But suddenly his anger turned to excitement when Calypso said that's why he was cute. The man was looking at him and said that because he was weak, he wanted to protect him and did not know what his next step would be, so he kept looking at him. He said he thought that was why he started to like him. Calypso asked him, smiling, if that was the right answer. The guy stared at him motionlessly for a few seconds and then blushed deeply. He pointed a finger at Calypso, asking if he had prepared this speech. The man looked at him in shock, asking what he had prepared. Hyunmin said that he sounded like he was reciting lines from a drama and couldn't have just thought of it right then. Then Calypso said that he would ask now, and turning to Hyunmin, he asked what he liked about him. At first, the boy purred in surprise, and then, clenching his fist resolutely, said that he liked him because he was handsome. Calypso asked if that was all, and if the man had nothing to say about him. The man turned away and said he thought he should be grateful for that reason alone. Hyunmin shyly turned his head away to apologize, but the man was fine. The boy was silent for a while, looking at Calypso, and then said that he was strong and also loved him. The man turned to him smiling and asked if that meant he liked him because he loved him. Then, embarrassed, Hyunmin said that he probably just loved him too. Hyunmin looked at Calypso seriously and asked him if he still loved Odysseus. He was silent for a while and then with a sigh began to address the boy, but he interrupted him by telling him to wait and not to answer yet. The guy laughed and scratched the back of his head and said that he shouldn't ask such a question. He told him that he had heard that first love was hard to forget and told him to forget that he had asked. Hyunmin was laughing, but tears were already appearing in his eyes and he noticed this and purred inquiringly. Calypso stood silently for a few more seconds and then abruptly approached the boy, took his hand, and pulled him into a hug. While holding the boy close, the man addressed him and said that he and Odysseus had different meanings in his eyes. Calypso said that he was just a faded memory for him and he didn't even remember what he looked like. The man said that Odysseus was his unhappy old love. Then he said that his wife and children were the most important things to him. Hyunmin thought for a while, and then blushing deeply, he asked the man in shock if he meant that he had had an affair with a married man. Calypso replied in the negative, saying that it was more like unrequited love. Calypso said that as he already knew, he kept him here because of his selfishness. He said that even so, Odysseus did his best to be a good friend to him. The man said that the reason he remembered him for so long was because of guilt. He said seriously that this was why this time he would not repeat his past mistakes. Calypso turned to Hyunmin and asked if he wanted to be with him. The boy looked at him and said that of course he did. Then the man said that he meant whether he wanted to stay with him forever. When Hyunmin asked in surprise, Calypso confirmed it. Then the guy lowered his head and said that he wanted to be with him, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to be with him forever. Hearing this, Calypso's eyes grew sad. He lowered his head and his hand slipped from the boy's shoulder. Suddenly, the man grabbed his hand and said with a reddened face that he had said he was not sure, but he had not said no. He held the man's hand, looking away in shame. Calypso smiled and took the boy's hand with his other hand and agreed with him. Putting his hand to the boy's temple, he said that maybe he should ask him again some other time. Maybe he would change his mind. He then took his hand and told him to go. When the surprised boy asked where he was going, he said he wanted to show him something. Celebrations on Olympus. Hermes was sitting on a couch watching the others having fun. He said that they seemed to be really bored, so let them party as if they were all going to die tomorrow. Hermes exhaled and said that he had given it some time. Athena appeared behind him and coldly asked him what he had given her. Then the man turned around and addressed the girl, laughing. She looked at him coldly and said that he was hiding something. The boy asked excitedly what he could be hiding. Hermes said that nothing was happening that was worth worrying about. Athena pointed her spear at him, reminding him that he had said he had gone to Calypso. She said that he was able to escape then, but not this time, and ordered him to speak honestly. At that moment, Hermes said, laughing excitedly, that they were like two jellyfish. Jellyfish is a mortal woman whom Athena turned into one of the three Gorgons, meaning that she and Calypso would be made Gorgons. Hermes shouted loudly, asking for help. He was laughing nervously while Athena told him that she had to give him credit because he was tough and his stubbornness was something. She tied him up and tickled his legs, telling him to try to stand it. The man laughed until he was in tears, asking her to stop and he would tell her everything. She stopped and said that he should have said it earlier. Hermes breathed a sigh of relief, saying that it was horrible. When he stood up, Athena asked him if it was a lie about feeding the Kraken ragweed with nectar. The man smilingly said that it was true, but he did not feed it, and it ate it all by itself. When the girl pointed her feathers at him, he said that he was not finished yet. Hermes asked if she had ever been in love. Athena looked at him in surprise, asking what he meant. The man said that it was a very interesting thing, and Calypso exchanged his powers for an antidote when a person's life hung in the balance after eating a lotus. Athena asked him thoughtfully if he had brought the antidote. He answered in the affirmative, saying that Calypso had taken it from Circe. Hermes said that he had been wondering where such power came from, and after thinking about it for a while, he found the answer. Love. The cold girl asked what the point was and said that it was all nonsense. Then Hermes said that she was the goddess of wisdom, and then that they would wait until the two of them had worked things out between them. He said that there would be other ways for their father to find out about them. Athena even came back and said she wasn't going to tell her father about it right now. She said it was necessary to correct his habits. Hermes smilingly thanked the girl and asked if he could kiss her. She objected in disgust, telling him to leave her alone. The boys were approaching the waterfall, and when Hyunmin asked about the waterfall, Calypso answered in the negative, saying that it was a little further. He told the boy to be careful and not to slip. Hyunmin squeezed the man's hand tighter as he walked forward. Calypso looked at him silently for a while and then picked him up and said that it was better that way, smiling. The man smiled and thanked him, thinking that he had carried him so many times that he had lost count. Suddenly Calypso stopped, realizing that he was feeling the same way as when he had become exhausted and started to fall into the water. He wondered if this one was because he had used too much force. The man thought he had to hold on, and as he held Hyunmin tighter, he thought he had to be more careful. Hyunmin looked at him in astonishment, asking him a question. The man replied that everything was fine, and her excited boyfriend could only agree. When they were close to the waterfall, Hyunmin noticed a passage under it. The man took him there with slow steps, and he wondered if they were in a cave. Suddenly, Calypso said that this is what he wanted to show him. When Min turned his head, he saw incredible beauty. There were many beautiful plants around, and everything was shining. When he saw this, the boy's eyes widened and he exclaimed in delight. Calypso let him go, and he walked on his own 2 feet, even without support. Walking in front of him, Hyunmin said it was beautiful and asked if such places were real. He looked at everything enthusiastically, not noticing anything but the beauty that was around him. The man quietly walked up to the boy and slid his arm around him and put it on his body. Calypso smiled and quietly said in Hyunmin's ear that he was the first person he had shown this place to. After that, he asked what he thought, if he liked it. The guy blushed deeply, and his heart beat loudly, thinking that he was the first one to answer in the affirmative. Hyunmin first lightly touched the man's hand that was hanging on his shoulder with his fingers and then grabbed onto it. Looking down, he asked if living together forever was really possible. Calypso said that if you let a man eat ragweed and nectar, he can live forever, just like the gods. The boy was seriously thinking about living forever and not aging. Meanwhile, Calypso said that it was okay, so let him think about it a little bit. After that, the man's head fell on his shoulder. Hyunmin turned to Calypso in confusion, and then he began to slowly fall. The guy picked him up and turned to him again and asked what happened. He called out to the man, asking him to say something. When he noticed that the man's eyes were closed and he showed no signs of moving at all, he was very frightened. Hyunmin then loudly called out to him to wake him up, because what he saw sent chills down his spine. 3 goddesses of fate, the caves of Moira. The girls were playing cards, and the goddess of the future, Atropa, smilingly said that she had won. The angry goddess of the past, Clotho, said that this was unfair and asked if she had looked into the future again. Atropa asked her how many times she had to tell her that victory was not really a triumph for them. Then the goddess of the present, Lachesis, stretched and said that she was tired of playing cards all the time. She said that she had heard that there was a party at the Olympics, but they had no work and could not relax. The sad Clotho said that it had been so long since they had been weaving the thread of life that she had even begun to forget how to do it. The girl said that in order for them to work, one of the gods had to die, but they were practically immortal. She looked at Atropa while she was calmly eating something and said that she knew what was going to happen, but she would never tell them. The girl said that she was really worried that the yarn might become just another piece of junk. When Clotho looked at the yarn, she jumped up in surprise and pointed it out to the others. Clotho and Lachesis quickly went to the thread, saying that they needed to spin yarn. Meanwhile, Atropa calmly continued to drink and smiled. Then she calmly put the cup down on the table, and when Clotho took the yarn in her hands, the girls calmly agreed. The girl's eyes lit up and she began to pull the thread. Looking at her, Lachesis said that it was Calypso from the Ogygia. Clotho enthusiastically asked if it was the one who loved Odysseus. She confirmed this by asking if he eventually broke his heart from longing and what happened to make him so weak. After that, she handed the yarn to Atropa and told her to cut it, that he was unlikely to live long. Atropa smiled and turned her back on her sister. Atropa began to smile but was confused, asking what she was doing and saying that she hadn't left the work in the middle. My sister smiled and turned her head and said she was going to talk to Zeus. Lachesis asked why, and Clotho asked if you would go to Olympus, saying that she wanted to go too. Atropa agreed, saying that if her sister wanted to, then let her exclaim joyfully. Calypso was lying on the ground and Hyunmin was holding his shoulders and telling him to get up. He put his hand to his forehead, saying it wasn't hot. The guy closed his fist, thinking that he had to go back because he couldn't help here. Calypso opened his eyes and grabbed the boy's hand and turned to him. Hyunmin asked how he was doing. The man put his hand to his head and asked if he had fallen asleep and how long he had been out for. The surprised boy said that he hadn't been asleep for long at all. He looked at him in confusion, thinking that something was wrong with him. He remembered that Calypso used to be very strong before. He thought that he was still strong, but now he seemed weak for some reason. Hyunmin looked down and remembered that he had changed since he ate the poisonous fruit and fainted like that. He didn't know what happened, but he said he cut his hair because of it. The boy shuddered and began to realize that it was his fault that Calypso was going through this because he was weak. Holding his hand in his lap, Hyunmin clenched it into a fist. Then he turned to the man and said that he was supposed to tell him that you can become immortal by eating the dish. The boy asked if it would be impossible to get sick or injured. Calypso answered in the affirmative, saying that his body would be as strong as God's. After that, he smiled excitedly and said that looking at him now, he probably wasn't sure about that. Calypso smilingly said that something like this happens very rarely, so he should not worry about it. He said that he would be fine once he got some rest. Hyunmin said without looking up that he wanted to eat it. When Calypso heard this, he looked at him in surprise. Then the boy looked up, looking directly into the man's eyes, and told him to let him eat the ragweed with the nectar. The man continued to stare in amazement without saying a word. He put his hand to Hyunmin's cheek and asked why he had changed his mind, saying that he could have waited longer. Calypso seriously asked if he was sure he wouldn't regret it. Hyunmin put his hand to the man's and said that he was sure and wouldn't worry about it. Olympus. The three goddesses of fate, the Moira, came to Zeus. While the man was quietly drinking something and reading a book called How to Be Loved Forever, someone came in and addressed him. Zeus was told that Moira had come and they had something to discuss with him about the threat of life. Hearing this, the man asked in surprise, and his eyes rounded. He abruptly closed the book and seriously told them to let them in. Hyunmin blushed and breathed heavily. Calypso grabbed his waist behind him and whispered to him not to do it if it was hard for him. Excitedly, he said that everything was fine and continued. Tearing off the leaf, they both began to smile, and the boy said that the leaf was very big and strong. Calypso thanked the boy for trying so hard for him. There were many leaves on the ground, and the boy asked if they were enough to lie on. Calypso said it was not bad for a man. The gloomy guy asked if it was a kind of compliment. The man said it was a powerful compliment and meant he was better than most. They laid down on the leaves, and Hyunmin asked when he had found this place, and the man said a few years ago. Calypso said that even if this was his island, he didn't know all the places on it, and he would never have thought he would bring someone here. Hyunmin looked up and turned to Calypso and asked if things would have been the same if he had been a woman, if he would have loved him then. After some thought, the man said that he did not know and was satisfied with the current state of affairs. He said that, for example, he could have a child. The man thought about it and said that it would be nice. When Hyunmin looked at him, he asked what was wrong. Then he asked if he could change his gender. Thinking about it, Calypso gulped in surprise, and Hyunmin nodded in the affirmative. The man laughed and said he was funny. He said he was not sure because he had not even tried it. Turning to the other side, the man said that he was too weak for God. Hearing this, Calypso clenched his fist, thinking that it sounded quite painful. Hyunmin was smiling and saying it was fun. He said he was having fun spending time with Calypso like this. He said that when they first met, he would never have thought that they would just lie together like this. He said that people from where he lives would call this kind of relationship the Stockholm Syndrome. Calypso approached him and kissed him on the forehead and asked if it was not normal as long as he was happy. He was smiling, saying that he would make sure that he did not regret his decision. Calypso was fixing the hair on the boy's forehead. Hyunmin looked at him and then touched his hand, saying that he was looking forward to it. Meanwhile, the sisters knelt before Zeus, saying that they had come to him. The man told them in a cold tone to tell him why they had come here. Clotho said that they had come, of course, for the threat of life. Her sister was followed by Lachesis, who said that she belonged to Calypso of Ogygia. When Zeus heard this, he was surprised and asked if this was the friend of Hermes. Atropa stood up and asked Zeus if anything had happened at the Olympus. The man said that they had a celebration, and if she didn't mean that, then Hermes was conducting an experiment, and that's why he stole the ragweed and nectar. After that, the sisters looked at Atropa, and she calmly said that she thought it was worthwhile to reinsure the amount of ragweed and nectar he had left. The man looked around and said that there should be one less because Hermes had taken one. Then the maid went to Zeus and whispered something in his ear. When he heard this, he became very angry, and electric shocks began to rise around him. He said to Hermes that he had warned him hundreds of times. Atropa bowed her head with a smile and said that he should know something else. The man told me to listen to her. Then the girl looked up and said that a man had entered this world. After that, I shouted loudly, and the palace was struck by lightning. Hermes flew smiling and exhaling, saying that he was so tired. He thought he would stay there forever. He said that if a person ate this nectar and ambrosia, he would not be able to return to his world, and his father would not be able to do anything about it. He ran happily, saying that then Calypso would not be so depressed. The man called himself a great friend. Suddenly, lightning struck him, and he started to fall, thinking that one lightning strike and he would not be afraid of anything. One sister asked if she had found him, and when she answered in the affirmative, they dragged him into the carriage. Clotho apologized to Hermes, saying that Zeus had ordered him to return. Then the other sister said that he was insane. After that, Atropa asked if everyone was ready, and when she received a favorable answer, they set off. Hermes was brought to Zeus again, and he knelt down and looked at his father. Then Zeus told him to clarify something. He said that Calypso had fallen in love with the man he had kidnapped, and that he had brought him ambrosia with nectar, that they could be together. Then he said that it was eaten by a Kraken and asked if that was why he stole another one to try again. The man said it was a funny story and asked why Calypso was always drawn to people and every time it was the same sex. Hermes noticed that Zeus said it was funny and asked if he would let them. But his father coldly denied that he would ever allow it. Zeus told the messenger Hermes to listen to him. He said that Calypso had kidnapped a man and let him into the world of the gods, and that he had obeyed him. The man said that he had ignored the orders of nature and tried to feed the man the food of the gods. When Hermes heard this, he turned to his father with determination, but he was not allowed to speak by the servants who immediately crossed the spears in front of him. When they put the spears back together again, Zeus raised his hand and said that he had become so weak that it had affected his thread of fate. The man said that he had brought him ragweed. Taking all this into account, Calypso is facing a punishment of 100 years, although he will not go anywhere in the form he is now. After that, Zeus pointed his finger at Hermes and said that another person from Calypso should be expelled from this world. The bound Hermes remained sadly silent for some time, but having no choice, he simply agreed with his father. Hyunmin was sleeping on the leaves, and when he woke up, he opened his eyes, wondering when he fell asleep. Turning around, he turned to Calypso and wanted to ask him when he fell asleep, but he didn't see the man next to him. He jumped up in fright, thinking about Calypso. Suddenly he heard laughter and turned his head to see a man laughing and asking if he was looking for him. The man turned to Calypso and said that he thought he had fainted again. He then asked how long he had been sleeping. Calypso answered in the negative. He then went up to the boy and stroked his head and said that he hadn't shown himself because he was very nice when he was looking for him, but he had made him worry. After that, the man got down and kissed him on the forehead and apologized. Hyunmin blushed and reminded him that the man had told him not to go anywhere without warning. The man continued to smile, saying that he was right. Then his eyes narrowed and he asked the boy if he did it on purpose. Hyunmin spread his legs so that his clothes were pulled up and showed his private parts. The man said that he could see everything, but he didn't mind. When the guy realized what was going on, he blushed even more and then turned around to cover himself. He said that it was because he was not used to these clothes. He was very embarrassed and said that it was not fair that he was wearing a long robe and he was given a short one. While the man was laughing, Hyunmin remembered the feeling of the first day when he was cold from such thin clothes. Then he suddenly walked over to Calypso and grabbed him by the shoulder and sat on his lap and began to take off his clothes. The guy said that he should understand at least a little bit how he felt. He was looking at the man's naked body, thinking about what he had done, but he felt like he shouldn't have done it. He continued to look at the man's body and swallowed his saliva, pretending not to be embarrassed by it. Hyunmin asked him why he wasn't flinching, because it scared him. Then Calypso said in a calm voice that he didn't mind. He then smiled and told him to continue and that he wouldn't interfere. The guy turned away in shock and mentally cursed, thinking that he had completely forgotten that he was a pervert. Calypso exhaled, smiling, and the boy pouted, thinking he was angry. He squeezed the cloth in his mind, wondering if he thought he was going to back down just because he said it. Then Hyunmin leaned over and bit him on the ear. When Calypso flinched, Hyunmin stared at him, wondering how it felt to have what he had done applied to him. Then the man grabbed him by the shoulder and turned him over, putting his back against the leaves. The boy's heart began to race. Calypso hovered over him with a reddened face. He turned to the boy and said that he would ask him only one thing. This was followed by a question if he wanted him to stop. The boy's heart was beating frantically, and he wondered in his mind what he should do. After a few seconds of silence, a negative answer came. They rubbed against each other, and with every movement Hyunmin shuddered. Sounds of pleasure could be heard around them. The boy scratched Calypso's back, and the latter continued to push inward, looking at him calmly. Their bodies were intertwined into a single whole. When they finished, they both began to gulp for air. Calypso stopped to look at the boy, and he turned to him and asked if he was the same man who had been falling unconscious the other day. He could not understand how he was doing it. The man said in a calm voice that he had forgotten that he was not human again. For a while he stared at the boy without looking away, and unable to stand it, Hyunmin turned away, covering his face with his hand, and asked why he was looking at him like that. When the boy turned his head like that, the marks left by the man on his neck were revealed. When Calypso saw this, he smiled and then came closer to his face and said that it was because he was pretty. The boy's heart beat fast, and he hugged the man, closed his eyes, and said that he loved him. Calypso was silent, and then smiling, he hugged the boy and asked him if he loved him back. Hermes was flying, remembering his father's words that the man should be expelled from their world. Then the man agreed, but asked if he could make one last request. Zeus looked at him coldly, asking what it was. Then the man raised his head and asked if he could give them some time before banishing the man to their world. Hermes said they needed time to say goodbye. Zeus was silent for a while, twirling his mustache, and then said in a calm voice that he allowed it. Now Hermes was thinking that he had not even thought about Moira's sisters. He wondered how much power he had used to make it affect his thread of life. After that, he cursed, asking what love was. Hyunmin was bathing and smilingly said that it was refreshing. He turned to the man and raised his hand to him, saying that the water was good and inviting him to join him. The man was sitting on a rock, but agreed if he wanted to. Calypso looked at the boy and from a distance ran his finger first over his cheek and then over his stomach, examining every mark on his body. When he wanted to look down even further, he saw a smiling Hermes addressing him. He sat in front of him and said that they were so cute that you could see it from a mile away. At that moment, Hyunmin bubbled into the water behind him. Calypso looked at Hermes, saying that he was early. Then the man stood up and asked if they could talk in private. Then the guy from the water looked at them questioningly. When they were alone, Hermes turned his back on the man and told him that Moira had come. When Calypso wanted to ask, Hermes turned his head and said that they were the same three goddesses of fate. He turned to Calypso and asked him how much of his power he had used, what effect it had on the thread of life. Calypso turned his head away and said that he thought he was strong enough not to be caught, so he was surprised that he came. He then asked if he had an order in his hand. Hermes held out the scroll in the affirmative and said that it was an order from Zeus. After that, Hermes opened the scroll and said something, and Calypso became very gloomy as he listened. At first he looked sad, and then he lowered his head and fell to his knees on the ground, covering his face with his hand and crying. His friend sat down on one knee in front of him, supporting him.